I think on top of making the process simple to get the rights to protect their property, I think council perhaps should promote the fact that they are going to do that. So that will encourage people, because there's not much point in me spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect my property if my neighbour doesn't, because suddenly, just attacks me from round the side. So that's the main purpose of me speaking, so that asking council to make it simpler, and of course with that cheaper. And as a byline, I've taken the opportunity to criticise the wisdom of doing the whole job. And on top of that, I'd like to pay tribute to the person who you got to do it, who has done an absolutely fantastic job, and he's great to deal with. Are there any questions?
Councillor Clout.
Yeah, thanks very much, Barry, for coming in. So, have you constructed that seawall in front of your house? What about your neighbours on either side?
Yes, I have constructed the seawall as soon as I got approval to do it. I've also taken protection further up my property. My one has quite a gentle slope up to the house. The house is well forward, and there is one steep part. But in the big wet of 2003, we identified the area where the line of seepage, where we've put a retaining wall. We've captured the water and we piped all that water to the beach so that the bank stays dry. And I think I've done a lot of protection work. I've actually got some geotech engineers looking at the bank at the moment to do even more, because I like to sleep at night when it's raining. I've got one steep bit that I'd quite like to protect. There are a lot of banks that are a lot more dangerous than my one. In fact, that's why I bought the property. I've always liked this property, and I tried to buy it many years ago and was unable, but when it came for sale, I've been there now like 17 or 18 years, and we love it to bits and we feel very safe there. And but of course, my front lawn's 22 metres above high tide mark, and these maps show my house gone. So, that is why I'm wondering about the wisdom and, in fact, the accuracy. Because the maps, there has been no account taken of protection work, and I understand that, and I can see why, but when we have protected it, and it's still valueless, it seems to me to be something that is a bit of a worry. A lot of people have protected their properties along there. Neither of my neighbours have, but I don't see that as a criticism. It's just where they are in their lives.
Councillor Bullock.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Just in talking about your neighbours, how would you suggest that we make them do what you've done? It is better to do it all together, obviously, as you've said. But how would we go about kind of making that happen?
Well, I don't think make is the right word. I think it's their property and they can do whatever they like. But I think encourage is a good word. And I think we need to encourage it, firstly, by addressing the process for getting a resource consent. And once that is done, perhaps a bit of a low-key public campaign, or even letters because it's easy to identify the people that are affected, a letter of information to them, telling them what's going on. I think is pretty simple.
This is sort of the first stage of that, really. The maps are what help to make people aware of what potentially is coming. And
well, no, I think the maps have frightened the hell out of a lot of people unnecessarily, and I think that. But that's not why I'm here. That's not my job to address that. That's your job. But my job is to is looking at protection, making it simple, lower cost, and encouraging people to do it.
Councillor Malloy.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Just in terms of consent and structure, you're looking for a standardised system that would make it simpler and therefore cheaper, and encourage people to act on that. And this would also include possibly some standardised structures that would have a sort of a pre-approval, so that the people didn't have to go through that process. Is that the sort of direction you're coming from?
That's absolutely the thrust of what I'm saying. And, you know, if people use the standard one, of course it's their choice to go through the process to do something else. But that's their problem, isn't it? I think that if they use the standard one, then I don't see why there should be a huge cost or huge difficulty in getting approval to protect our properties and your rating base. You know, this map shows all the houses around me gone, wiped out, which seems to me, as a layman, a little bit hard to believe.
Councillor Currick.
Barry, what was the total cost of the wall and drainage for that project?
I did a lot of the work myself with the help of engineers and some young, strong men. So probably I have spent $40,000 or $50,000 so far, but I'm getting engineers in to look at more. They spoke about one wall being worth $500,000. I can tell you that won't be happening. Their own costs are pretty horrific. Probably I will probably spend another 150,000, I would think, protecting my property. Which, unfortunately, if the neighbour doesn't do his, I've wasted my money.
If the neighbour didn't have the resources to undertake a lot of the work themselves and through family or friends, how much do you guess would be the cost to undertake a similar amount of work? Say your neighbours.
Yeah, I think you'd put a basic seawall in for probably 30,000. At a very broad brush guess. That's a real good start. You know, with any bank, the erosion doesn't happen up there. It happens down here, and if you fix this bit, you've bought yourself a huge amount more. But if you don't do that and it erodes back, you get vertical, falls down. Then house falls down. Then no rates paid on it. The seawall is the start of the process.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Can I just ask, I noticed the report writer this afternoon is Emma Joyce, but Cam, are you going to be present this afternoon for that report? Oh, this morning, sorry. No?
What I propose is that because Mr. Benson's here, we actually change the order of business and deal with that now. Sorry, have you finished your question, Councillor Brown? Councillor Granger.
Hey, thank you, Barry, for coming along. I like that word encouragement, I really do. What if we took it one step further, created an incentive from council? And when I say that, to give you a good example, maybe the possibility, and it's only just off the cuff here, that the likes of maybe a low rate loan that you could pay off over a certain period on your rates to help those property owners get where they want to get.
That would be absolutely wonderful and well beyond what, you know, my wildest dreams would be. And I think that something like that would make a huge difference, because there are people who have done seawalls in the past that probably are no longer fit for purpose, who are looking at it thinking, well, it's okay, but if there was some incentive, I think that would be huge.
That's good. Just one other point to touch on too. You mentioned about the standard plan, which I quite like if we can form a standard plan. The only thing is, though, no doubt there's some properties so much different to others where your standard plan would start to vary a little.
My answer to that is that the standard plan obviously is the base, and you know you've got sand, you've got a bank. The difference, of course, and there's a formula here for the height of the wall as to how deep it would have to go, and how big the poles would have to be, and how far apart. And beyond that, I don't see a lot of variation, to be honest.
Question from myself to council officers to address the 2 points Mr. Benton has raised. With regard to the first point in terms of the erosion maps, when we were dealing with inundation, there was a process by which a resident could apply to council, and council would do a site visit and measurements and all that sort of thing in order to verify or otherwise the accuracy of the map. Is that possible or appropriate in this particular case? Who am I addressing that to? Mr. Larking.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the lovely kind words. In answer to your question, actually, it's not. So the study we did was a district-wide study, and it broke areas like Mongatapu into 2 or 3 cells, and the uniformity of that cliff face isn't that different. But Barry and I have had a good couple of conversations, and we go way back with some other work we've done. And what we've done with Barry's property, and also a number of other ones that have protection structures, is we have recorded on the property file the resource consent, images of the seawall, and we recognise that. The other thing we need to remember about the map is the map was council's direct contact with the property owner. That map doesn't actually sit on the limb. What sits on the limb is a general statement that talks about the property being subject to coastal hazards. And it is in relation to a number of coastal hazards, not just erosion, slope instability, which Barry's rightly talked about. And it also in that limb statement recognises that different properties are subject to different probabilities of that hazard occurring, and that it is able to be mitigated through the existence of protection structures. What we then do is send a person to our coastal hazards website, where you can then explore on that mapping tool the issue of slope instability and time. And the big issues with these properties, like all properties, is that you're caught in the situation of having to think about 100 years from now, and the uncertainties of these sea level rise projections. And so you're putting up to 1.6 metres of sea level rise consideration in the erosion, which you need to do for your planning, and you get caught up in this limb information, sharing information. The reason why it's not appropriate in terms of going up to the property is that this is very much a geotechnical issue that is nuanced, and you would need to do a geotechnical report, where what we did with the flood maps from the intense rainfall events is we were using a LiDAR, and LiDAR can in some instances be inaccurate, or there can be protection structures on the property that we are not aware of within that, and so we go and do site-specific surveys using council's own staff member. But I think that the pathway that Barry and I have worked through is we've changed the key, we've recognised all those things. And that's kind of where our study begins and ends. If you're going to go into further detailed work around the harbour, I'll be asking you for millions of dollars, which we would then have to go and do condition assessments of every private and public structure. We would have to make decisions over whether that private structure was built in accordance with the plan, so that everyone was using marine grade timber rather than H31 saying it was marine grade timber, and those kind of things. So you've got to choose a point as a city where you start and stop, but we also need to recognise that it's the site-specific information that is produced long-term that we need to record on our property files to aid in the recognition that, in this case, this property is actually protected, and the existing seawall has brought that property time, but it has the long-term risk is that the properties around it will be subject to erosion and slip instability, which may negate the seawall, which is what Barry's here to talk to you about. That was the answer to your first question, I hope.
And yeah, my second question is in terms of the consenting, Mr. Benton. I think it took 4 years, is that right? It was over 10 years ago, though, but it was a 4-year process. Is that correct?
That's correct. And a lot of this was because TCC and Regional Council couldn't really decide whose responsibility it was. That was a big part of it, and there were others, of course, too. That's why I say mine might be exceptional, but I think that issue probably still remains because some people's seawall will be on public property, some will be on private property. Mine is basically on private property, on my property, but that could change with others, or it could be in front of the Esplanade Reserve, or behind it, or in the middle of it. So there's all sorts of questions like that complicate the issue, and I just think we should have a standard, simple answer to each one of those questions. Tick, tick, tick. Simple, as quick as that.
Question to officers in terms of our city plan and obviously the regional coastal plan, etc. Are those, in your professional opinion, are those planning documents sufficient to enable a streamlined process that doesn't take 4 years? Or do we have some changes that we may need to do or lobby our good friends at Regional Council to do?
That's an interesting question. If you are taking this from the stance that Barry is presenting to you, the answer is no, there's no streamlined process. They are individual consents where you will need one from the Regional Council, and that has its own process, and if you are disturbing significant earth around the margins of Mean High Water Springs, then you will also need a consent from the Tauranga City Council. They can be processed separately and jointly, but they ultimately have the same information, and I think there's a clear pathway that needs to be resolved. But there's quite a long journey in front of you and in your organisation. Barry's raised some points. You've got a lot of issues. There's building a seawall on private land. The policy that's in front of you today is a conversation about allowing someone to utilise council land to protect their private property, and you are governed by the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and other planning documents. And then you've also got those that would be in the bed of the coastal marine area, all right? And so all of those, you're all nodding your heads, is that there is a challenge here around creating that streamlined process. And it actually starts with a fundamental position between the two councils. What does your adaptive planning process look like, and does that include a protection process? And is this council going to be involved in aiding that protection process, or are you then going to leave individual landowners to themselves, and what is the streamline of that, or are they just in their own devices? So there's actually quite some significant fundamental calls, and I don't disagree with Barry's position. You have a significant amount of properties that are currently at risk of slope instability and long-term erosion if we see these sea level rise scenarios occur. It is the first step in front of you is to determine how you're going to utilise council-owned land and how you're going to meet your national policy objectives. The follow-on phases then are creating that streamlined process and working with the regional council, which will ultimately require plan changes.
I've got a bevy of questions now, starting with Councillor Mason.
So if we cut to the chase here and ask about property values, Campbell, if I could ask you, what is the impact? How many people are buying houses or have houses and want to sell them perhaps in situations like this that Barry's got? Is it starting to affect property values? Are people asking about them? I see people building houses along places like this all over the city. Nobody seems to be worried about it. But is that right? I mean, are people some worried? What are the long-term implications of property values?
So I can't actually answer that in this data. This data is brand new, right? We spoke about this two months ago. However, it is clear that properties that have had these information on it they have changed hands. I can't tell you whether they've affected value or what they do. Generally, what we find is when these go out into the market, and what we have along our open coast, is that there might be a small blip in the market and price, and then it just starts to come back to normal, in fact escalate. And the Mount North open coast area is a prime example. There are a significant number of properties within coastal erosion zones, and it doesn't seem to affect that. And I think it's more about this perception of what the present day situation looks like and how long we're going to be in the property, and also this role of these uncertainties. And you've seen this across the board. You've got flood hazard properties that are being traded. You've got those at slope instability zones. So I specifically can't answer that question, but we have seen limbs issued, we've seen property sold. I don't know what that impact is on property values, if any.
Okay, I've got Councillor Granger, Councillor Stewart, then Councillor Baldock, and we will conclude after Councillor Baldock. Councillor Granger.
Campbell, it was just mentioned by Barry this morning as regards to being quite alarming getting this sort of information in the post. Don't you think there could be a better way to communicate to these people? Because I think if I was one of those neighbours as well, receiving this in the post, it would knock me back 6 feet as well. So what I'm saying, isn't there a bit better way to communicate? Because the thing is, you know, to get something like this, read that information, it is quite shocking. So I'm looking for probably a little gentler way to go about it, and a little easier way.
So, do you recall how we communicated this information? Or shall I run everyone through it again? Because when you think about what's a gentler way, there are not many gentler ways in which to prepare for natural hazards information. And so the pathway that we selected with this and we discussed with you was we would send out a letter with a map in this instance, and then that leads to a significant number of phone calls which we have set our staff up to receive and communicate. And then we also set the ability to book into a booking system where we held community sessions for one-on-one sessions. So Barry and I caught up in the Waimapu and we worked through that. Also, I've been to a number of people's houses and had one-on-one conversations with them, and we've also then followed up with, in the same way with Barry, about recognising those protection structures. So if you think about that sequence, that's the pathway in which we've gone. I'm not sure what better communication is. My worry is that you start telling people that it's going to come. It's like, say, the bank manager saying, we're going to raise interest rates, but we can't tell you by what and by when. So preempting this isn't an easy task. And so what do? And your pathway is that you actually have to record that correspondence that you've had with this, and you need to share that. And so we've been, as I feel, as gentle as we can, but there's no question when you are talking about long-term sea level rise scenarios, the news is never a great message, and it's extremely difficult to communicate. It's extremely difficult to receive, and it's one that we've done our best to. And I think Barry and I have enjoyed our experience. Not the map, but our rebuilding of our relationship for a number of years ago when we worked on similar processes.
Just the point you mentioned there, Campbell, you know, as regards the sequence, I tend to disagree a little bit there. So sometimes it's better to communicate first to the people before throwing some information out that's pretty full, head-on information.
Yeah, and I take that on board. It's always, in this case, you're talking about a benefit of a hindsight space, and we always knew this was tough. It's why we came and presented to you on this and shared it with you. Our next release, which is the inundation release, won't have a map in it, but that's because of the sequence of scenarios are not additive like an erosion. It's about sea level rise and storm surge, and they're really difficult to portray in a map, so we're just building a viewer in this instance. So that map might not be as concerning, but it has the corresponding situation is you get a letter and no map. There's no easy pathway here. We've explored as many options as we can, but I'm happy to take your guidance. That's what you're here for.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair, firstly, Mr. Benton, thank you for coming in to raise your concerns, and I particularly noticed what you said about it taking 4 years for the resource consent, and you got the thought that perhaps whose responsibility was it, and maybe that's why it took so long, if I understood you properly. And through the chair, to our chair, are we going to do DC 173, which follows on after this?
With your indulgence as a committee, yes, absolutely.
I'd be happy to support that. And if I can just, well, perhaps we might flesh it out a bit more on the next paper, but the Chief Executive and I visited a ratepayer down Matua who also shares those concerns. When he raises concerns, it's like, is it regional council, is it TCC? And there seems to be some confusion or lack of clarity as to responsibility or ownership of the different issues. So I think it's one we can talk about in the next paper if you're interested in staying. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Concluding questions, Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, thanks again, Barry, for a chance. Just try and look over the Mayor's head. I'm glad to have the plan in front of us, because when your initial comments about, you know, your house is gone, we can now see that we're talking about 2080 and beyond, and that's the challenge of dealing with these predictions with the orange marks on there, perhaps a little bit into the yellow, but I wonder, given that you were not that committed to this scenario, whether you are absolutely confident that's going to happen. The difficulty here is that we have projections, predictions, estimates and so on about the level of sea level rise, and individual property owners may have very different views on that. What's your view about this likely scenario occurring?
Well, one of the scenarios here, is that going? Is that it is possible, but unlikely, that my house will be gone in 2030, which I think is a little bit hard to believe. But in saying that, if a potential buyer sees that, what's that going to do for the deal? So, you know, sure, one's 2080, but this is on the sheet of paper from the council that it's unlikely, but possible. So it's not very far away, really, when you're talking about a property. So no, I think that it's exaggerated, but I understand why council's doing it. Don't mistake me, but there's got to be perhaps a relook, I would have thought.
Well, thank you, Mr. Benton, for coming in this morning and drawing this matter to council's attention really clearly. Councillor Stewart, is it a very brief one? Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair to staff, is there a system in place where properties can be reviewed? Like if you're getting particular feedback, is there any process or system in place for that?
So I've done a couple of reviews on a couple of properties, but the difference of those ones from Barry's one is that where you start from a very low area and you start to climb quite quickly, there's a transition between those. So a great example would be, you'll know Thai Park out in Welcome Bay area. So it's a very low area and it starts to climb quite quickly. That band between there is a transition zone, and it can often get caught in either or of the cells we assess. In this case, it's not. It's a very uniform, very high cliff. And the key thing that we need to remember about these maps, which often gets confused when you look at a map without looking at the explanatory FAQ, is that the first scenarios that you've identified as 2030, they are slope and stability zones. So they are in two bands. There is a likely chance of slope and stability within the first band, that's the light yellow band. And then there's an unlikely slope and stability. And we have worked those on geotechnical terms, and they are generalisations within assumptions of the landform, but we've also looked at how our coast is regressing over time and a range of examples. And that unlikely band is not actually about an erosion of that entire coastline coming back. It's the consistent slips that we see around our harbour margins, bit by bit, and you lose a bit, and then that angle gets a new angle of repose, and you might lose another bit down the time. So that's about the slopes. And a great example around the unlikely, what we call the P5, is a probability of all the scenarios around, there's only a 5% chance of it getting back to that, is if you look up your aerials, there's a place called Bramley Drive in Omokoroa, you may all remember it. That directly aligns with this. And so when we say there's an extremely unlikely chance of happening, there is still a chance that it happens. Okay? And the only way that you get through this is you review it, you shrink those lines, but they're still going to have lines, or you remove that information outright. And the problem with that is that you use this information not to penalise a landowner, and I accept that that's the feeling that you get. It's actually to share that information, and through a redevelopment or an investment process, ensuring that everyone understands those risks and that they choose the right mitigation strategy for the protection of that asset. And that's really where Barry's coming from today, I feel, which is that there's always going to be a landowner issue with these maps, but it's our what's next and how do I achieve the outcome I need to achieve for my property, and you are part of achieving that. Okay, so I don't see a review as necessary for the level of detail we've done.
Thank you, Mr. Benton, and thank you, Mr. Larking. Chairperson's report, there is none. There are no late items. Confidential business to be transferred into the open. Is there any? No. Change to the order of business. I propose that for Mr. Benton's benefit, we move the paper on the coastal structures and considerations of issues and options therein forward to our first item. Can I have a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Baldock. Any discussion? I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against and carried. If we now look at the minutes on pages 8 to 38, before we accept those minutes, are there any corrections? Councillor Brown.
Correction on page 17, the meeting closed at 9:12 p.m, should be 9:12 a.m. I know we've had some late meetings, but that was not one of them.
Any further corrections? No. Can I please have a mover for the acceptance of those minutes? Moved by Councillor Brown, seconded by Councillor Clout. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against and carried. Are there any matters arising from the minutes? Declarations of conflict of interest. Mayor Brownless.
Yeah, in relation to a property at Vine Avenue, I'll declare a conflict of interest in DC 173. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Brownless. Moving on to business. Yes, Councillor Moy.
I was distracted. There was one correction on page 27. Councillor Malloy is listed twice, but it should be, I believe, Councillor Morris and Malloy.
I thought it was due to your your presence in the chamber. You count for twice as many as me. So, yeah, no, okay, that's noted.
You are too kind.
Thank you. Moving on now, colleagues. If you turn to page 175, page 175. Oh, is Mr. Benton left? That's right. While it's fresh in our minds. Okay, what I might do, colleagues, if we can just adjourn for a minute, would somebody mind just informing Mr. Benton that we are going to discuss this issue now? It might be to his benefit and or interest, so I'll just adjourn for 1 minute. Emma Joyce is going to present this paper to us.
Good morning, everybody. Kia ora. So this is the first look at our coastal structures policy. So this is its first review since it was written in 2006. So as you'll be aware, the legislative and policy framework around coastal structures have changed quite significantly since 2006. And in particular, looking at issues around coastal effects, climate change risk and sea level rise. So it's an opportunity to have a look at how Council manages its own structures with that policy framework in mind. So we're just happy to work through the report as you may want to.
And just for clarity, the attachment, the policy is the old policy, it's the current policy at the moment. So we haven't written a draft policy, we're waiting for direction from this meeting before we draft up a policy and bring back to you. So we've had this confusion in the past a couple of times. The policy included in the agenda is for reference, it's the old version.
were you going to lead us through a PowerPoint presentation, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's just some pictures up there if we need issues, if there's a reason, if we want to clarify something, and it's easier to do so through a picture rather than words. Yeah.
Okay, colleagues, what I propose is that we work through the issues one by one and then come to a resolution at the end. So can I have a move that we suspend standing orders? Moved by Councillor Stewart, seconded by Councillor Clout. Any discussion? I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Okay, colleagues, turning to issue... Well, actually, no, before we do that, any questions? Councillor Stewart. And then
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just following on from Mr. Benton's concern about his perception that there didn't seem to be ownership of who was responsible, whether it was our council or the regional council. Is there something in this policy that we can make a bit clearer to people reading it as to whether it's the regional council or TCC? Just, is there anything you can think of that might assist?
So this policy mainly applies to how council manages its own structures, so that's the structures we own. In terms of private structures, they would always have to apply for a regional resource consent anyway, but that's not to say that TCC couldn't assist them in that way, and the issues discuss that a little bit further on around issues 5 and 6 as to how TCC could support private landowners like Mr. Benton.
Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, just before we get into the various options and go through, I just wonder if we can get a baseline of sea level rise. In the chart or the drawing that was given to us by Mr. Benson, we've got 0.13 metre likely by 2030. So currently, sea level has risen. What is the actual, in the last, let's say the last 20 years? I understand it to be about 50 mil to 60 mil max. Can we get a reasonable baseline of this, please, as we start? Okay.
Sorry, give me the mic, just for the recording. Austerity.
Sorry, please forgive me. I'm not quite prepared to be here today. Okay, so my answer to my question was sea level rise on average for Tauranga has been rising about 2.1 millimetres per year. That is a consistent average. It's slightly higher than the national average of 1.9 millimetres. It is certainly not on a map, Councillor, if you're heading down a trajectory of saying, are we going to see the hockey stick rise? That is not what our prior history is. We have not seen the beginnings of that very significant, but that is what you'll be given in a range of sea level rise scenarios is the long-term predictions if CO2 emissions continue, okay? So it's not, it's pretty steady rise and slow and pretty similar over time.
So at 0.2, 0.1, that makes 210 millimetres over 100 years if that's if the rise is the same. Correct? Okay. And if people like myself get a hybrid and a plug-in electric vehicle, we might manage to control some of the CO2 rise. So when we come to the first point of include reference to the likely effects, do we need to have likely, or are we able to use words like possible or potential? Because I think what we heard from our speaker this morning is that words have an effect upon people when they receive them. Likely, when we are talking about 1.25 metres, which is almost 10 times that average rise we're seeing now, the words perhaps need to be looked at. Can we have a response in that regard, please? Without being a sceptic or a denier, we just have some reasonable language around this.
Through the chair, if I may, we can definitely look at how we word specific policy wording when we come back to you with the draft and take that into consideration. One of the things to bear in mind when we work through the issues is that it's quite clear that regardless of whatever sea level rise might be, that sea level rise needs to be considered as a future circumstance under our Local Government Act provisions. The legal advice doesn't determine it has to be a specific level, it just has to have regard to these things as a future circumstance.
Councillor Baldock, when we're looking at recommendations, if you look at recommendation A1, you may wish to move an amendment regarding that. That's A1 on page 176. Councillor Mason.
Sorry, can I just broaden the conversation slightly? It's not just about, it's just a question, it's not just about sea level rise, it's about there's storm surges, there's a whole bunch of other things that impact on erosion. It's not just the one thing, is that correct?
Through the chair, that is correct. You'll see a reference to coastal effects, and when we talk about that, we're talking about storm surge and inundation. Yeah.
McLeod.
Thanks very much. Given that this policy was first initiated in 2006, I'm just wondering why it's coming to us now and maybe not several years ago, or is there a regular sort of schedule of updating these policies? I'm just interested in what's prompted this right now. Thank you.
Through the chair, I can't say why it hasn't come up. Obviously, it's not been a priority in terms of the policy work that we've been doing. There has been some specific issues that we've had with implementing the policy, specifically around what happens if we decide not to maintain one of our structures, particularly if that's adjoining an Esplanade Reserve. And so the asset owners, so the parks team, have said, hey, we've got some issues with this policy now. Can you have a look at it? Previously, there was no real reason why it bumped up the prioritisation.
Chair, have you got some photos you could put up to show us in that regard?
I could, yeah. So just have a look at this picture. This is a property down in Matua. Obviously, the seawall on the left was not in a great state of repair. It adjoins a small Esplanade Reserve, Esplanade Restrict, and there's a private property owner behind that. So we weren't necessarily maintaining that. It was fine for our perspective, but the landowner wanted some work done, so we worked with the landowner to redo that protection structure. So before and after, so that's just an example of a current situation that we're working through. Obviously, in that instance, it was we worked with the landowner. This is another Esplanade Reserve in Matua, which has experienced some storm damage. So one of the things we have to look at now is that this is a small Esplanade Reserve. Possibly you could walk down there, although it's very unsafe to do so, and it has been closed off to the public. We could obviously look at protecting that and redoing the rock revetment or the seawall, but the question that we should be asking, and one that this policy is going to, hopefully if you look through the issues and options, will say, should we? And that's the question that we need to start looking at through the policy.
Through the chair, with that first photo, did the ratepayer contribute towards the works?
So yes, so the ratepayer agreed to pay for that through an arrangement with council. It's also to note that the rock revetment, the seawall there, is actually on our council land as well, but yeah.
Solid as a rock. Councillor Clout.
It was the same question. I just want to know, did the ratepayer pay for all of that, or did council contribute something?
Through the chair, I'll just ask Mark from Parks to talk about that.
Through the chair, good morning. Yeah, we paid to vary our resource consent for coastal structures. The ratepayer paid the whole cost of that remediation.
Thank you. There was a question over this side of the table. Councillor Baldock.
Well, it does raise questions, like thinking about Memorial Park to the CBD, for example. It'd be interesting to know just how many of those properties will have a similar situation, and we will be addressing the cost of that, the cost sharing of that, how all that would pan out, depend a lot on where the property boundaries are, I suppose. Can you comment on that?
Through the chair, that's definitely something that we talk through. One of the issues that comes up in the paper around council around structures that may protect private property on council lands. It's one of the issues that we do talk about in terms of, you know, the funding and the cost sharing of that. That's something that's not specifically addressed in the policy issues and options here, but obviously it might come up through the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Kira.
Yeah, excuse me. There doesn't seem to be any differentiation between dwellings and land in terms of property. Like, for example, the photo on the right, can I make the assumption that the concrete strip adjacent to the rock would be the property boundary and the rock would be on council land? And if so, well, what I'm getting at, if the dwelling was, say, 200 metres away from that, and that was simply a big green grass lawn, versus a situation where the house might actually be, you know, 2 or 3 metres away. In the policy, is there any differentiation of that sort of circumstance? Are we looking at protecting grass lawn when there's no threat to the dwelling, compromising the dwelling? Or are we, you know, tending to more focus on protection of dwellings?
Through the chair, that will be something that you can consider when we go through the issues and options. One thing to be mindful now is that the current policy is quite clear that it sort of says we won't do new private structures to protect private property. Doesn't say what sort of private property, but that's something we're asking you to have a look at through the policy review. We don't have a differentiation, and in this particular example, some of the green grass is actually an esplanade reserve with limited public access. Yeah.
In terms of a policy made under the LGA and consistency with the regional coastal policy statement, how do those two things go together? Are we able to be inconsistent with those higher level planning documents, because this is a policy essentially done under the LGA? Not the best look, but is that possible?
Through the chair, so whatever we put in a policy, if obviously we have to comply with the Resource Management Act and the Regional Coastal Plan. So this is, if anybody still wanted to build a seawall or a structure, council ourselves would have to make sure that we have a consent to do so, and a private person would have to do that as well. This is just sort of asking that initial question, should we actually go through the resource consent process, or should we say no? And we do already have consents in place to manage most of our, or all of our structures. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of issue 1, we have one potential issue raised by Councillor Baldock in terms of likelihood, which we may address when we come to the resolutions. Any other issues there that need to be identified before we adopt resolutions? Councillor Mason.
Sorry, do you mind if I just challenge that idea of likelihood, and that are those words consistent with a broader New Zealand way of describing this particular situation? I'm just wondering, is it wise to play with words when in fact it has got significant meaning in a broader context in New Zealand? Can I just ask about that?
Through the chair, likelihood is quite commonly used, as well as things like potential. The key thing that we're supposed to look at is to consider that it's a future circumstance, and that word is the likelihood of future circumstances. So whether we use likelihood or potential, there's no consistency, only that we consider sea level rise, coastal effects as a likely future circumstance to align with the LGA, but we could use either.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. Emma, is there any learnings from what the Western Bay have done in Waiheke Beach? Because they've got their rock revetment wall there along their front coastline is amazing. So have we got learnings from what they've done, or anything that we can take from that?
Through the chair, yes, we can. A lot of the policy that they have written for their structures, we've updated ours to reflect that so that there is a consistency, particularly within the inner harbour that we share. The particular example at Waihi is complicated due to consenting issues and also targeted rates for payment. So for example, you pay more of a targeted rate for that seawall if you're closer to it, and then less as you go back. We don't specifically address that issue in the policy, although that's something you could consider. But yes, definitely we're looking to align processes.
Okay, working our way through issue 2, colleagues, the definition of structures. Is there anything you wish to identify before we move to resolutions? That's on page 179. 179, 180. Yes, Councillor Malloy.
That the purpose of hard protection structures is to protect an existing or future council activity in the policy purpose. I just wonder whether here's the appropriate time to bring in the relationship with the protection of our inner harbour coastline with the private owner. I see very little in here about the private landowner. They talk about the private landowner in relation to building on Esplanade reserves, but I don't think there's anything that I can see about the private landowner protecting from coastal erosion on their own property. And I just wonder whether this is the point where we need to have a discussion around that as to whether we should be trying to facilitate that as a logical and a sensible step forward in terms of protecting our inner harbour going forward. There is going to be natural creep in terms of erosion. That's going to be speeded up by sea level rise and an increase in storm surge. So we do have issues that we need to work on, and I think it's going to be a partnership with the private landowner eventually, starting probably now. Thank you. I just wonder whether
Thank you,
how
Councillor.
we work that into it.
So this policy is in relation to council land, is that rather than private land? Is that correct? And so, would the appropriate place to address the valid issue that Councillor Malloy raises, would that be through an LTP conversation in terms of private landowners and protection?
Probably missing something. I'm not entirely sure what we're talking about. If we're talking about what private landowners can do on private land, where's council's involvement in that conversation? If somebody wants to do something on their private land, and as long as they are meeting the city plan's requirements and all that sort of bits and pieces, do we get involved at all? I guess that's the first question, Terry.
So Malloy?
It's the protection of the inner harbour is something that it's going to affect us all, and private landowners who don't provide any protection, that will eventually impact on us. So I'm just wondering whether there should be a discussion around that it's not just us protecting our amenities, but we need to be cognizant, I believe, of the wider community's amenities and how that should be protected. I don't think we can throw our hands in the air and say it's got nothing to do with us, because I believe it has.
Yeah, I think the point's certainly made. I mean, within the scope of this particular paper, it's just dealing with council land, but there is a conversation to be had. Whether what flows from that is a discussion around funding, city plan issues in terms of consenting on private land. If it's on private land, then it shouldn't be in the coastal area, so you may not have an issue with the regional council, but that's a wider conversation than what we're dealing with today. But you're right to raise it, Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, in a similar way, I guess 1.4 in the options is retain general statement that council has no legal obligation to protect private land from naturally occurring erosion, which is a very clear statement. But then we look at that picture and we understand there's an arrangement being made where the private landowner paid for that. Council, I think, did the consenting or something, but we're going to end up in myriads of issues where we have precedences and negotiations and so on going forward, which we're just not prepared for. And this isn't dealing with this, is it? This is, our land, our structures and so on. But we are going forward having to deal with a heck of a lot of stuff here. And that's possibly what Councillor Malloy's touching on. We can't do it under this policy, I think is what we're hearing.
Yeah, and I'd like to support the previous two speakers. It's very hard to untangle the private and the public. And this, I know this property very well. I've been quite involved in it, and there was there's the Esplanade Reserve. Then there's a running up the side. There's a water reserve or water reserve or whatever it's called. But and then there was the stuff that they had been speaking to the council.
Explore what our options are. I suppose thinking about the recent Productivity Commission draft report, where we have private individuals benefiting from council structures that are obviously provided by the council, funded often by the ratepayer. I just get the feeling that in this discussion we're missing a conversation around concomitant financial issues, budgetary issues, the implications. We're sort of once again talking about policy without talking about cost or numbers. And I appreciate we need to start this conversation somewhere, but I suppose I just want to put on record that I have some discomfort with making some decisions around some of these recommendations when I have no idea in terms of, certainly there's nothing provided in the report about the implications of this. So I may be making a promise that I cannot afford to keep, which those of you who've worked with me for the past 4 and a bit years know is a place I'm very reluctant to go, even more so in an election period. So I'm just, I suppose, asking that at what point do we start addressing the related issues here? Because I fear that doing this in good faith may in fact, unless we have a pathway forward in terms of addressing and exploring those other issues, and perhaps a mechanism coming back and re-evaluating these in the light of what the implications are, we are creating hostages to fortune, significant, very expensive hostages to fortune. So if perhaps the chair could advise, as the chair of the policy committee, how he proposes to walk us through this policy and the next stages to give me some comfort. Or perhaps he'd like the chief executive to pick that one up.
In terms of the maintenance, removal, placement of structures which may have some private benefit also, there's Esplanade reserves tied up there. At what point would we get some sort of a broad feel of the financial implications of a decision to defend, not defend, remove as a policy point, given the amount of coastline we have around the harbour? It's very, there's a lot of properties that we don't know the exact makeup of structures, etc., that are in there. But are we honestly able to come up with some sort of a feel for the implications of that?
We'll have a go at this, and Jeremy might add. So this policy is actually reducing or making clearer the extent of obligation of council in respect to private land, and it's also saying that there's clarity, there's going to be a need to prioritise, there's always a limited budget, and it provides a framework for determining which are the high priority structures that council is going to proceed with. We have done some work previously around, I can't remember, a number of years ago, around levels of service for seawalls, and did assessment across the whole of the city, and based on council put money in its long-term plan to progressively implement that, again on a prioritisation level over a period of time. I don't know if you want to add to that, Jeremy. So
that was quite a long time ago. It's probably 10, 12, possibly 13 years ago. It's quite a long time ago. But the genesis for this conversation, you asked earlier on, why now? One of the not why nows is that the parks team are getting requests and conversations which are well beyond their resources to meet, and that's why the prioritisation. The policy was initially created to identify and clarify ownership. That was the conversation back in 2006. Who owns what? Who's responsible for what? Who should consent what? The world's moved on since then. We've got all the consents sorted out. And now we're moving more into that, well, who's actually responsible for looking after these things? Potentially, who could be responsible for building new ones and under what circumstances? And we're looking for that really high level policy direction, what you're interested in, and we can start to flesh out on that. At the moment, there's a lot of unknowns as to what the implications are, and appreciate the comments from Councillor Robson. We don't know how big the can of worms is, but we need to open it and start to have the conversations. And in principle, are we happy to support and continue to support private benefit structures where they're wholly private benefit, where there's partial private benefit and there's some community benefit, or just ones with fully community benefit? And that's a high level principle conversation. We'll then come back and look at that and say, well, if this is kind of where you want to go on the principles basis, what are the implications? And we'll come back with some idea. But looking at the size of our coastline and looking at the variabilities around what the projections might be for coastal, for sea level rise, for storm events, for therefore erosion, it's kind of assumption on assumption on assumption. And it would be very difficult to say the answer's X million dollars by this period of time. We can't do that for you. We can give you an indication of the number and the potential scale, but that's all.
Yeah, I suppose it would be unreasonable, and I try not to be that, to ask you for a number today. I suppose I'm more looking for reassurance that we don't make a decision today in regards to DC 173 and feel that, right, we've dealt with that, let's move on, because there are so many flow-on issues, associated issues, including issues of cost. So what I was looking for is an assurance that, if you like, in the program of work around this space, there is either work being done for the subsequent papers that need to come to us, or there's a plan that work will be done at some point in the future, which will actually reinforce this, because otherwise I fear we will make a policy decision today. We will have a legitimate question from the media or a resident tomorrow or a neighbouring council, and our answer will be, well, we haven't actually thought the policy implication through, so our answer is, that's our policy, but we don't know. So I'm just looking for reassurance that there's a policy program that actually moves into planning and budgets and programs of work, and that obviously we have the resources in place that, you know, this is part of BAU of a council in 2019, particularly one that, perhaps unlike Palmerston, has coast.
Through the chair, just wanted to respond to that, because essentially we see this policy as starting the conversation, and where you're going is possibly somewhere into the future, but this is starting the conversation, and it really starts with the question that came from the parks team. Is like, we've got a fixed budget every year for maintenance of our seawalls. We do not think the current policy gives us good guidance on how we spend that money, so we're not meeting our test of financial prudence that we have to. So the question then came back is, let's have a look at how our policy can help us make those financially prudent decisions about what we do spend our structures on, and then we can go there and say, actually, how is our budget going to be spent for the next 10 years based on a new policy? Will there be requirement for more or less? I think Mark wants to add some comments to that. But that's essentially the starting point for this conversation.
Good morning again through the chair. If you are after some examples of recent seawall remediation costs, I'm happy to provide some of those.
Thank you, and I'd also take the point around wanting some direction around the existing budget, how that's spent. I've got Councillor Stewart, Councillor Granger, Councillor Baldock, Councillor Mason, then we'll move on. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I remember the conversation in the chamber regarding the seawall stocktake, and we put some money in for renewals. I don't think it was 10 years ago, but it was some time ago, maybe 6 years ago. So maybe if we could find that paper on that discussion and see how much funding went in, that would be a helpful start to understand.
Yes, yeah, understanding what the existing allocation is would be useful. Councillor Granger.
I want to go back a couple of steps. I'm coming back to these photos that's the one there. I understand that the work that was done was 100% paid by the owner, is that correct? Okay. The second question is that...
Right, that it was done under our council resource consent. So we have a resource consent for maintenance, but they paid for the works.
Yeah, okay. Any part of that, can it be used by the public or not?
Through the chair, it's public esplanade reserve, so people have a public way of access. However, obviously it's very difficult to get to that particular spot. But essentially, if you wanted to have a picnic next to that seawall, yes, you could.
And that's the catch, and we've been caught with this before, because when it's built like that, you know, people would walk along there and think, well, the owner owns this particular property, and all of a sudden, if they find out that they can walk along there, what is going on? When there should be maybe fences to say, well, okay, this little bit of area is land we can walk on. And that happens in many places along our foreshore. So I'm just getting a little mixed up here, you know, because when people find out that they have the right to walk along there, they'll be jumping up and down.
Next, we've got council. Sorry, yeah.
Through the chair, that site is not accessible on either side. So one of the reasons that council staff did not fund the remediation of an old failing wall was because there is no public access. We have across the city multiple sites of isolated Esplanade Reserve. Under the RMA, when there's a subdivision next to a coastal area or harbour or riparian area, council can take 20 metres of Esplanade Reserve, and often that's the case. And the long-term aspiration over maybe hundreds of years is that they are eventually all joined up and you create a coastal walkway. This site here is quite isolated, and you can see the water comes up to the wall. So along large parts of Matua foreshore, there is a coastal or low-tide walkway. This just happens to be one of those short strips where there is maybe 5 metres in depth of council-owned land, but it's not really accessible by any members of the public.
I know what you mean by not being accessible, but like you say, there's low tides, high tides, and on low tides you get many people walk across there. In some cases they might be saying, well, okay, that we have the right to walk along the grass area at the top if we wish to do so, which they are.
Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, I take Emma's point that this is the beginning of a conversation. So we're passing not a policy here, but a draft policy that we'll hear back from the community and so on. If I can just ask a question about point 9. Why are we binding ourselves, allow new hard protection structures to be constructed on council land where necessary to protect private property from erosion, subject to landowner approval and consent? What, you know, I mean, I understand you'd work with the landowner, but we're building something on council land which may be the right thing to do because of erosion. If you had a landowner that wouldn't consent for whatever reason, you know, so it's subject. We're saying subject to landowner approval and consents being, but we may wish to go ahead. Maybe it may be back in the case of earlier thing. This is the one bit that doesn't link up with every other property along a waterfront, and one landowner just says, I can't afford it, I can't do it, I don't want it done, I'm happy with the way it is. Why are we kind of binding ourselves to that? Could we explain?
Through the chair, we discussed that in, I think it's like issue 6 or 7. But if we just want to make a quick comment here. So this is, recommendation Roman numeral 9 is, at the moment, council does not allow a private property owner to build a protection structure on its land. One of the issues we want to discuss with you is whether we should not say no to those people at the start, but allow those people to enter fairly into the process of getting a resource consent rather than stopping them at the first obstacle. So that's something we can discuss further. The landowner approval, by landowner we're referring to council at that time, so it just gives council the option to,
Councillor
We're building on
Mason?
council land, we're talking council is the landowner. Well, I'm not sure that it would be necessarily obvious, it'd be depending on the circumstances at the time for what the seawall was and where it was.
Councillor Mason?
Thanks. I'm not sure if it's Jeremy or Emma. Could I just ask about the engagement aspect of this? I know it's going to come back to us, and then the engagement, because it seems to me that's the most critical part of this, the engagement, the consultation. Because from my limited experience, fairness is absolutely paramount here, is that everybody with a seawall looks down the road to see what somebody else has done, and or across the harbour, and they see the council's been involved and they've done that, but they won't do it now. So I know, and I really agree with the intent of this to make it more fair and more clear about what the policy will be. But the engagement to actually get there is really important. So how would you, could you give some sort of outline of how that's going to be done?
So through the chair, we have given some thought to those questions because obviously we know that this is going to be an issue for many landowners and residents. Obviously we have information on where there are structures, so we'll be working with our systems to pull that information out about who is the ratepayer and landowner for that. In terms of further consultation, it will have to be consulted publicly as we do with all our council policies, but we'd be looking possibly even to do some where we know that there are issues, maybe some smaller workshops with areas that are more affected, but in terms of how we've done that, we haven't thought about it yet, but we will be coming back with some further engagement framework plans.
Okay, in terms of, again, issue 3, the removal of structures, do we have anything in the PowerPoint which shows when we would remove a structure?
Through the chair, if we look at that situation there, obviously it's storm damaged. There is some debris, possibly a health and safety issue if anybody went down there. There's the things that we would look at if we were to look at removing a structure. I do know that we have now said to the contractors who would mow that little bit, please don't go down there, it's a bit unsafe, and it has been closed off. So that's the kind of example we'd be looking at here. Obviously this is Esplanade Reserve, people have a right of access, but it would be very unsafe for them to do so.
So by way of example, we're talking more about a board with a nail in it and other hazards which have occurred due to damage rather than removing a rock revetment wall, etc. Yeah.
Through the chair.
But there are times where removal is also not maintained to allow natural processes to gradually remove it over time, as opposed to going in there with a digger and digging it out.
Mark Smith.
Through the chair, and this example here is there is no public access. It's further around on Matua foreshore. So normally a council-owned structure would provide infrastructure to support access where the public could use it, for example, as a boardwalk. In this case, the only benefit is to the private landowners above. So if we create a structure down there, then should the legal advice we received during this question was that should we create that and it fails, then we are liable for the properties above as well. So there's, as Councillor Mason mentioned earlier, there are multiple and complicating factors involved with a coastal structure.
Okay, moving on, colleagues, to issue 4. Any comments you wish to raise on issue 4? Issue 5. This is around allowing private landowners to assume the ownership of structures. Issue 6. Seven.
Sorry, going back to issue 5. So if we do allow private landowners to assume ownership, what's the responsibility of the landowners for ongoing maintenance for those?
Through the chair, the advice we've received is if we enter into an arrangement with a private landowner, we would also require that landowner to have a maintenance schedule attached to the title.
Issue 6, existing structures on council land. Issue 7, new private structures on public land. Councillor Curate.
I think this is the appropriate section in terms of the issue I raised before around when council considers a request from a private property owner to be able to build a structure on public land to protect their property. This is where I'd like some differentiation in terms of whether it's to protect a dwelling or protect the property boundary, which could be quite a large area, perhaps lawn. And so how do we have criteria to perhaps provide that differentiation? Because it's quite different in terms of protecting a dwelling, the importance versus protecting someone's large lawn in front of their house.
Through the chair, we haven't offered that distinction here, but it's certainly something that we could come back to you on if that's something that you'd like a bit more information or consideration of.
I'm sort of open for others. Councillor Baldock is not supportive of that, but are there any other members that agree with that approach? Are we providing access because potentially there could be a walkway adjacent to that boundary, which would mean if we allow that property owner to build a wall to protect that property, could compromise public amenity.
Look, I'm not opposed, but I'm just asking why there would be a difference between private land or land that a house is on. If we have an Esplanade Reserve along there and they want to protect, the boundary, which protects that Esplanade Reserve, so public access is still, we're not allowing them to build it, and block off. I just struggling to understand, Councillor Correct, why we would make that distinction. It's private land. They want to protect it, and that may include protecting our land as well. So I
think, Councillor Currick, you're talking about construction within the Esplanade Reserve that may restrict public access, such as having a rock wall. Is that correct?
Yeah, but just generally also the ability for a private landowner to build a structure on public land, which could, compromise something, whereas only to protect a section of lawn or garden. I can understand if there was a house and that was 2 metres away and they required for a certain area of land to enjoy some outdoor recreation, therefore that would require or would benefit that landowner if they could build a wall on the public land. I can understand that, but where there might be a large area of this section that they could quite easily build that structure on their own land, I would consider that not a priority to request that structure be built on public land.
So would you be interested in making a distinction between proximity to a habitable dwelling as opposed to protection of land, much the same way that we do with flooding?
That's correct. It would be a certain distance in terms of metres. If the dwelling is further than, for example, 5 metres from the boundary, then that, or could be 10 metres, I'm not sure of the actual distance, but something reasonable, then we could, in that criteria, could say, no, sorry, we won't allow you to build on public land because you have got adequate area of land within your own property to construct that wall.
Can I have some advice on that before I ask Councillor Currick to draft something?
We could certainly bring back options in a draft. A straight meterage thing would be tricky because 10 metres on flat land might be a perfect distance back, but if you're on the side of a cliff and then you're going to want the right setback if the cliff's 100 metres, and you're going to want a whole lot more than that. So there's probably some criteria around what is the private land that you are protecting and what's it used for and what's its purpose, basically. We could bring back some options, and there's different views around the table, and we might end up with option A within the policy being protecting all land versus protecting land which has got habitable properties on it or close to it or whatever. We could bring that back, and this is where we do that 2 or 3 rounds of this process. Principles today, get some words, some options come back, you like option A, not option B, and eventually we end up shaping a draft policy. So we could bring that back in.
Through the Chair, as part of one of those options, we could look at, is there any impact on public access? Because if it's not having any negative impact on public access, if they want to protect it now rather than in 30 years' time when it is within your 5 metre or whatever meterage, why would we not allow that? So it's really about, is there any negative impacts on the community or the public as a consequence of that? If there's not, then maybe that is a better criteria than just a distance measure. Or potential, so those types of things really may be more appropriate.
Are you happy to have that as an option when the paper comes back rather than formulating a resolution now and voting on it? Thank you, fantastic. I've got Councillor Stewart, Councillor Mason, then...
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just going back to before Councillor Currick had his question. If I heard you right, you're saying that if the owner wants to take over a structure, then you would put something on there. I thought you said on their title, but do you mean on their, their file at council? You can't put something on their title, can you?
Correct. It would just be some way of saying to the next, if they sell the property, that there's that caveat on the property that you actually have requirement to maintain this.
On council file?
Yep, so private, yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Mason.
Yeah, I just support the idea of general principles, not sort of making, things on right now on the hoof, which is a really complicated, set of questions. Let's let the experts guide us, and it's a better way to do things. Thanks.
Robson.
Yeah, I don't think, well, I'd hope the intention of elected members isn't to make procedural decisions on the hoof, but I think it's to raise issues so that when staff are framing policy, they have particular scenarios in mind. In that regard, could we go back to the Matua picture, which seems to have been the topic of some conversation already? That one there. Is there a reason why, and I'm just thinking about council spent some significant sum just down here providing steps that one could go from a place to a place. Is there a reason why steps couldn't have been provided to effectively signpost the fact that some of that land is totally publicly available? So in other words, we put the rock revetment all the way around, but is there a reason why a set of concrete steps couldn't have... I'm just trying to understand, not with the purpose of addressing this particular issue and not with the purpose of specifying concrete steps, but just raising the issue of how do we ensure that public land, we signpost in some way that public land is public land, and don't allow effectively through, this is the most effective way and efficient way of addressing a particular issue, the privatisation, the effective privatisation of public land, the effective, endorsing of encroachment by effectively making a sign that you can't get up here. So my question is, was thought given to signifying by use of certain devices, steps being an obvious one, to let people know? And would that have been a cost issue or?
Probably talking to the wrong people on the design of a rock revetment.
Sure.
From a policy
But the
perspective. I'm not sure whether
principal
Mark was available to answer that one.
The principal issue being, privatisation of, we're doing a lot of work over at the Mount to stop people who are busy annexing the beach and would quite happily have a lawn to the surf.
Through the chair, we can always take that guidance in the future for further conversations with the public in other scenarios like this. In this case, we didn't pursue steps. It's quite hard for anybody, you're right, it's quite hard for anybody to understand this is public land. And this section here is quite isolated. There is no linking Esplanade Reserve to come from either side to denote that it is a Esplanade Reserve. It's just a low tide walkway and people walk along the beach to get from A to B.
Yep, supplementary. I think I've got a way of drawing this to a conclusion, but yep, this
Just want
particular
to mention
issue.
it, just as John mentioned before, it sounds great, John, to include those steps, but would the owner look at that as regards to him paying the 100%? I don't think so. The only thing that worries me is, like you say, they've paid for that themselves, and you just imagine anybody that has the right, if they wish to do so, to walk along the top of that wall. I could just imagine the owners, and there would be many do that, say, excuse me, but get off that, I maintained that, I paid for that. And these things will happen. That's what worries me.
Councillor, that was a direction from Councillor Granger to Councillor
Just perhaps an insight which might give some understanding of this wider situation is that what does happen is that, say there's a 20-metre esplanade reserve at the bottom of somebody's garden, and then as the years go on, that piece of land gets smaller and smaller because the water erodes and erodes and erodes, gets to 15 metres, 10 metres, and then the people get on the blower to the council saying, can you please protect it because it's going to infract, your esplanade reserve is going to get walked away, it's going to get into my land. So, and then the council says, no, we haven't got enough money. There's not enough budget for us to protect. And that's a situation that does happen a lot. And so we have to come to terms with that. And I'm not going to give any situation here because it's private property, but there are situations that happen quite a bit all around. So we need to, do we put more budget in? At what stage do we protect it? If it's just one garden, you might have 10 properties all in a row. Some people may put quite a bit of, there's no point putting a big wall at the bottom of your garden if it's going to encroach and undercut it anyway. So, there's a whole massive amount of technical complications here, and I think this gives good guidance to going forward. But budget, it's going to become bigger and bigger for us in the future.
Okay, colleagues, if we look, just concluding that, and I notice Taupō District Council, what are they calling themselves these days? Great Lake Taupō. They, of course, mark where the Esplanade Reserve is around the lake. They do it with pegs. It's readily identifiable. I suggest that if colleagues want to have that discussion, that's outside of the policy, but it is a discussion that would be an interesting one to have. There's obviously some people who would take umbrage at that possibility, but then of course there is, the public land belongs to everybody. It's not private. So anyway, that is a discussion for another time, but a valid discussion to have. If we turn to our resolutions that are recommended on page 176, 177, is anybody prepared to move something? I've got Councillor Baldock got his hand up. He's getting in first.
Could I just ask that A1 is moved separately so I can move that amendment just to that bit without the whole thing together, and I'm going to just suggest one word change. Okay, so I'll move A1, include reference to the possible effects of climate change on structures.
Councillor Baldock, you can speak.
Yeah, I mean, we know the sea level has risen. We know how much it's basically risen by. We've heard how much it's going up on average per annum. To get into the scenarios of 1.25, 1.5 metre and even to 6 metres, as has been at times projected by some enthusiasts of the whole climate change scenario, is just too unsure. I might recommend to my colleagues the Chernobyl TV series drama, which has recently been advertised a lot. You look at what happened in Chernobyl and the predictions about the devastation there of the nuclear radiation being for hundreds and hundreds of years, yet we are seeing things change much quicker and returning to some normality sooner. It's not saying it's all okay now and there's no radiation, but when we predict things over 100 years, we do have to maintain a certain amount of humility about our humanity and how we can see into the future accurately. So I think possible is a reasonable word rather than likely, which tends to weight it more on the it's going to happen rather than it could happen. We're not deniers, we're seeing what's happening around us. So I hope that might be acceptable.
Councillor Granger, do you wish to speak?
I think it's been said, and the word likely to me, it's well above the 50%, and to me the possibility, it can go either way.
Further speakers to A1 that's been moved. Councillor Mason.
I'll vote against this. I've just discovered that there's an app called Wiki Difference, which is, as adjectives, the difference between likely and possible is that likely is probable, having a greater than even chance of occurring, while possible is usually, stroke not comparable, but not certain to happen, not impossible. In other words, it's a 50-50. Likely is a more than even. So there are big differences between those two.
Thank you for that contribution. Councillor, who was next? Councillor Robson.
Yeah, I'd speak against it as well. I think it ill behoves someone to sort of start complaining about an adjective and then replace it with another adjective, which there is clearly going to be debate about. I would suggest that the wisdom of Solomon suggests we take the adjectives out and we just include reference to the effects of climate change. And if this motion should fail, and I hope it does, I foreshadow that.
Okay, any further speakers? Councillor Malloy.
I will vote against this. We're actually seeing the effects now. We have, you have friends who live on the coast, and they're already been quite severely impacted at this point in time. And 90% of the scientists, I understand it's a figure like that, certainly support the dramatic effects of climate change. I do have some concerns though about us drawing lines on maps. I think we need to be very careful what we do there. But no, yeah, I won't support this.
Okay, given that it's not an amendment, you have a right of reply, Councillor Baldock, if you wish to use it.
I appreciate that, thank you. I appreciate Councillor Mason's little quick look at the differences of the words. I can't criticise him because he drives an electric vehicle. Another speaker, of course, who still drives a straight six vehicle, is perhaps open to some comment. What we're ruling out here is whether we are able to address carbon emissions, and I firmly believe that if the theory holds going forward, though I don't hold to it myself at this stage, but if it holds, we will reduce carbon emissions. We will see a massive change to electric vehicles and many other changes technologically driven that will reduce carbon emissions over time. And all these projections are based on the fact that if we don't do anything, and I think we will respond. We always do eventually respond in some way. So I think possible is the better word, because we're ruling out our own individual responses to look at it. Yes, Councillor Malloy, we do see the effects now, but we do not see the effects at the rate that would lead us to a 1.25, 1.5 metre sea level rise in 100 years. So I think possible is fine. Thank you.
Okay, the right of reply being exercised, I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye and raise your hand. Those against, and 6 myself, so that fails. Councillor Robson, you have indicated through your speech that you wish to move an alternative A1, or are you prepared to move an A1, which is potentially different to the one that's just failed, and the rest of the numbers and B? That would be, for the sake of efficiency, I'd encourage you to do so.
Taking that as a small hint from the chair and appreciating his wisdom and often his wit, I propose to move as the chair has indicated, right, with a minor amendment to A1. Yeah, so
Been moved by Councillor Robson, seconded by...
If I can
seconded by
add
Councillor
one word
Curran.
in 9, that's just above B, just if we can add the word allow consideration of new hard protection. It just seems a bit definite without consideration. Allow consideration of, if the mover is happy with that? Yeah.
Okay, so three changes. A1 is just the deletion of likely. If we go down to A9, the changes to that will be displayed for your viewing pleasure within a few seconds. That there, that's 9 above B. And that, so the two changes there, consideration, council land. So that's been moved and seconded. Mover, do you wish to speak?
I will, and I'm going to take a risk here. Look, I'd like to thank staff for bringing this in front of us. It is a major issue. The point I would like to make is the climate change thing needs noting. It's part, if you like, BAU SOP in 2019 to recognise that. But we also need to recognise a much older construct, which is the second law of thermodynamics. And the reality is that erosion is always with us, climate change or not. We need to understand the impacts of that, climate change or not. We need to think about how we protect landforms and structures, not just councils, but at some point private property with the implications that that has, climate change or not. So this is the start of a conversation which shouldn't be anchored simply in climate change, but should be anchored in the reality of the changing world in which we live and the need for us to act prudently going forward, to shepherd resources, to put them in a place where they deliver the best outcomes for the peoples of this city. This is going to be a reasonably long and I believe ongoing conversation. It will require at some point the allocation of significant budgets. That will be a challenge to our inability generally to prioritise. I would observe that over the long term, the impacts of nature on Papatūānuku is probably significant and even transformative, but it's incremental. It takes a very long period of time. We have time to act and to do what other nations do, and that's to prudently conserve what we prioritise and perhaps leave to nature what we can't protect or don't value as much. I thank the staff for this policy. I thank the staff for starting the conversation. I look forward to continuing the conversation, perhaps even after October, depending on how things go.
Seconder, do you wish to speak?
Just briefly, I share Councillor Robertson's comments. I think it's a good way forward. I think it's well balanced and a good job done by the staff on this in terms of that first step. And we will eventually engage with our community. There's more work to do. It'll come back to a council and progress with it. So I look forward to either participating or hearing about the progress being made.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I support what's on the table, especially because the draft policy will be reported back to the policy committee, and then once that's done, there'll be consultation. My concern from speaking with members of the community is they seek better clarity, understanding and collaboration between the councils and ratepayers on matters pertaining to coastal structures. So I hope through this process that we can improve that better understanding and collaboration between the councils and the ratepayers.
the speakers. Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, I think removing any objective removing likely is better than none, but to not have any adjective there leaves it with a bit too much certainty. I'll still be supporting it because we've got to go out to consultation, and I think we'll hear from the public, and we'll also be going through a process as we've talked about before. But if we simply say include the reference to the effects of climate change, we of course end up with maps like this, which we've already heard from one resident are a bit concerning, because we're open then to every different interpretation of what those effects are instead of what is something closer to reality of what is occurring at the moment.
Councillor Mason.
Yeah, just it's great to see this come forward because it creates clarity for the public and for staff. And I think when you get clarity, you get a greater feeling of fairness, that people will be treated differently, because it has this issue for different landowners have been treated differently, or appears to have been treated, them to be treated differently. And so this creates the clarity of that. So I'm very happy about that. You know, and the harbour defines us. It's one of the major factors that characterises our identity. So it's really good that we're focusing on this. And lastly, the issue of property values. This does create, for perception or otherwise, the importance of people feeling secure, that their property is protected. And I guess just one last point about the whether we should be putting in some sort of rule or policy area around dwellings on land. I think private land is private land, and the little that we should not be encroaching on that to any great extent or putting too many rules where other policies may benefit. So yeah, I think saying that people can just go over private land willy-nilly is not. I don't think we should be going anywhere near that. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Granger.
Yeah, I will support it. It's going out to the public. Let's just see what they feel. But to me, it's second best. The word possibility was the best word to use, because for me and you guys as well, you tell me how much you can predict in the future and what does and doesn't happen.
Councillor Malloy.
Yes, I'll certainly support it, but I just like to note that I look forward to us working with private landowners to come up with a sensible, balanced strategy that helps us all protect our coastal margins. So I don't think we can ignore that.
Right, a reply.
Not required, thank you.
Okay, in that case, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried on the voices unanimously. Colleagues, before I press the AZ5 button and break for coffee, I propose that we deal with the review of dangerous, earthquake-prone and sanitary buildings policy. If we do that now, while there's still enough water in the reactor, and then we'll break for 10 minutes and then deal with the CCOs and then the naming policy. So if you can now turn with me, good colleagues, to page 191. Alternatively, we can break for 10 minutes now. They're next door. Okay. That's great. Okay. I had another quote which I was wanting to use, Councillor Baldock, but it wasn't appropriate. It was, why worry about something that isn't going to happen, from the last episode. But no.
I commend you on your recommendation.
Damn straight. Yeah. Very gradual. Very gradual, Councillor Granger. Welcome, Jane. If you'd present the recommendations to us, I understand this is really a legislative requirement, isn't it?
That's correct, yep. We are required under the Building Act to have a policy, and we're also, so we've got a draft policy on the table which we're seeking approval of to go out for community consultation, and also the adoption of the statement of proposal associated with that.
Any questions, colleagues, of the proposed policy? Councillor Brown.
Thanks, Jane. Have you contacted anyone like the landlords of downtown Tauranga businesses or the property council or anything? Because I notice there's nothing in here about any engagement yet. We're going straight from review to consult. What input have we had from other people that can support us or help us shape this policy?
At this stage, because we're directed a lot by the legislation, we've, as part of our project plan, we have kind of identified key stakeholders, and we've got quite a big list because we see that we have to follow the SCP in this process, but we feel that, just like you said, we're needing to do targeted consultation, and we're going to do that with the draft. So we haven't done any explicit prior engagement, but we'll be talking directly as a targeted consultation with it.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair, page 196 in sanitary building to do with dampness. Just seeking clarity there. Dampness can be caused by a building being shut up for a long time, so what sort of reaction are we talking about with dampness, please? How will that be assessed?
So again, the policy approach is that we will respond to any complaints or information from the community, and if someone has concern, then we will go and assess that condition, and because often that dampness may be, like you're saying, not to do with the actual building or anything physical with the pipes. It might be that they're needing ventilation, so our compliance team will advise the occupants of that and make an assessment whether it's to do with, physical structure or use of the building.
Okay. Councillor Clout, Councillor Robson, then I have an indication of movement from Councillor Baldock.
So just further to in sanitary buildings and dampness, etc., and state of disrepair, I'm aware of a property that was in Papamoa, and neighbours were very concerned about the state of it, and so our staff went along. They did a drive-by, and they didn't go into the property. So the question I've got is, what sort of powers do our staff have to go into a property rather than just driving by?
We don't have the powers of entry to a dwelling. We can only enter by permission. We can walk around the outside and do a site assessment. But if apart from getting a court order, then that would be the only way to get entry into the dwelling.
So just the question is, do we have any teeth? Does this give us any teeth at all? I notice in under paragraph 7, 7.1, etc., we have the ability to inspect. So what you're saying is we're inspecting from the outside, and then we can perhaps liaise with the District Health Board. Do they have any more powers than we do in this regard?
I think Councillor Clout's wondering whether we have powers under the Building Act and within which this policy kind of sits within, and to enter properties to inspect them.
As I just said, we only have the power to enter the site unless we're invited in.
Councillor Robson.
Just noting there's a couple of, or more than a couple of minor typos in here that probably need addressing. So I assume this is going to be polished before it's presented somewhere else?
Yes, it will be.
Thank you.
Councillor Baldock, you've indicated you wish to move.
A, B and C.
Have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Clout. Mover, do you wish to speak?
No.
Seconder? Other speakers? Therefore, no right reply. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against and carried, and we'll break for 10 minutes. Waiting for Brown's cows, Brownless's cows to return. Brown's cows is all right? Okay. Colleagues, if we can move to CCOs. And I have asked Councillor Mason, as chair of the CCO working group, to introduce the paper on the final statements of intent and also the enduring statement of expectations for the Tauranga Art Gallery and Teapot. So, Councillor Mason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I guess introduction is probably best, whilst I can introduce it formally. It's been a long process, and it's going very well, but it just, in terms of the detail, just ask Anne to work her way through some of these statements of intent. Thank you.
Thank you, and through the chair. So the first is the final statements of intent, and you may recall that the draft statements of intent came to council in April, and we went back with feedback as per the requirements of the Local Government Act, and most of the feedback has been incorporated into the CCO's final statements of intent, and if it hasn't, they've usually been very good reasons that it hasn't, and we're satisfied, the CCO working group was satisfied that everything was incorporated that needed to be. Just to raise your attention to one particular thing, so the Art Gallery Trust, so they have changed their forecasted director fees as we asked them to. They have got extra director fees because we have one extra trustee, which was approved by council, so that has gone up slightly. And then you will notice that we did ask that they remove the $266,000 that they put into their forecast from TCC operational because they hadn't put it through the annual plan and it hadn't been approved. But they are now showing that as a deficit, and the net profit you'll see in the forecast on page 16 of the Tauranga Art Gallery Trust's SOI. And they have said that they've taken it out of the TCC operational grant because we said that they needed to do that, but they said that the cost of the exhibitions, those are what the costs will be, and so they are planning to go to the next annual plan to ask for that amount. There's been an added difficulty for the art gallery this year in that you may remember a couple of years ago that the Tauranga Foundation, Art Gallery Foundation was set up, and the art gallery was looking after the money from the foundation, and this year has had to transfer that money into the foundation now, so that has caused them some added issues. So you're at liberty to receive and agree all of the final statements of intent, and you can request that issue is resolved in the forecast for the Art Gallery Trust.
Councillor Mason?
Yeah, I just would like to foreshadow that in the resolution, this is a question and I guess a statement as well, for D, that we receive the Tauranga Art Gallery's financial statement and request further information from the art gallery, and just and if we were to foreshadow that and get further information around that particular projection, would that still allow us to meet the statutory requirements in terms of or the policy requirements in terms of the timeframes of statements of intent?
Yeah, we just have to receive the SOI, but we can go back with one final request for a change, yes. Although I'm not sure how the art gallery will make that change, but that's up to them to find an answer.
Suggesting is that we request further information so we can make an informed decision.
Any questions, colleagues?
Yeah, just following on from the comments with regard to the art gallery and the budget issues for next year. I notice in the subsequent years, 2021 and 21-22, they are in their budgets assuming a significant increase from TCC. Is that currently, are those figures currently in our long-term plan? So while they've amended the 1920 to reflect the current budgets of TCC, they haven't effectively amended or changed their forecast to reflect the current budgets of TCC.
Through the chair, they are planning on coming through the next annual plan process with an internal submission.
And making the assumption that that will be agreed to prior to debate and with no evidence it's in our budgets.
Interesting point, right? Of course, it is their intent, a statement of intent, but it does have to be approved by council. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair, did I hear you say there was some concerns or difficulties regarding separating the funding? Could you just elaborate on that, please?
So several years ago, the foundation was set up. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and there was about $400,000 worth of money sitting in the Tauranga Art Gallery Trust bank account that's subject to some requirements that we had of the art gallery in setting up the foundation, so setting up as a charitable trust and providing a certificate of proof and all of that, that they so they've fulfilled those requirements now. So about $400,000 has been transferred now into the trust, and that trust is to work on future sustainability of the art gallery, and that's what it's intended. But it has left the art gallery with a problem, yes, of just transferring money, yes.
They weren't perhaps fully aware of it, or is that what you're saying? Or
I think they were aware of it, but I think the timing of it hasn't been easy for them yet.
Councillor Robson.
Could we have a little bit more on that? You know, I'd like a bit more definition. One assumes there was some amount sitting in the balance sheet that was expected to be how can that, when I have an obligation to someone or a future obligation, I have a provision, I have an amount normally budgeted, when the time arises for me to sort of pay the piper or make a transfer, I make a transfer. It only causes me a problem if I've been using that money for some other purpose, and I'm unfortunately now in a situation where I have made commitments. Can we just get an explanation of why there's a problem here?
While the chair's talking, so the reason why I'm foreshadowing this, that we received the report, but we delete the words "and agrees," is specifically for those concerns, Councillor Robson. I have the same. I'd like to have it that just a little bit of background with this, with the last CCO working group, the issue around the funding, the additional funding request in the next annual plan. It was raised, and then the staff were going to go, of the art gallery were going to go away and talk about it, and then come back. And this is what they have presented and has come through in this document. And that is why I'm specifically saying that we need to, in my opinion, it is prudent for us not to agree with it, but to seek further information, and then we will agree with it when we're satisfied with that further explanation.
Look, I'm a little bit concerned. This is a CCO, we have a relationship, we have people working with these people day to day. I'm asking a pretty basic question here, and I don't know whether our finance people need to get involved, but why is it that this transfer has caused the art gallery problem? You know, there's got to be a simple answer to this, and I'm surprised that no one's able to provide this to me in this room. Is there something I'm missing?
Councillor Mason.
As Anna said, there was a sum that was transferred to the foundation. And we, at this stage, what we don't have in here is a balance sheet, as you can see. That would be described in the balance sheet between the two entities. There's entirely two different entities here. My understanding that part of that was in relation to when the council 2 years ago was doing the civic centre redevelopment, heart of the city. There was the art gallery was at that point considering how they might be involved, and so they were trying to prepare themselves for that. So that was part of that overall equation. But the foundation is a separate entity from the council. So what I would anticipate is that we get the full financial picture from the art gallery with both entities and report back. And this is specifically why I've said that I personally would not, endorse the two agrees at this point.
Along the same lines of equal concern is the single asterisk below the net profit, saying that rather than a profit for this current year, or the year that's just finished, 18-19, there's going to be a $75,000 deficit. So that's equally concerning. I don't know if that's operating profit or post-depreciation net profit. But either way, it's a concern as well. So clearly, yeah, we do need to look more in depth at the finances of the art gallery.
Any further questions? Councillor Mason, you've indicated that you wish to move something.
Yep.
Is that correct?
So-
But before we do that, I recall moving out of standing orders earlier on in the morning, but not reinstating standing orders. However, there is no provision within the standing orders as written for the reinstatement of standing orders and what that actually means. However, subject to Section 13.4 of standing orders, the chair has the ability to exercise discretion on matters not covered within standing orders. So I thereby make a ruling that for this meeting, it's not like speaker's rulings, it doesn't become common law. I therefore make the ruling that for the purposes of moving and seconding motions that occurred previously in the morning, those are in order. Thank you. Councillor Mason, you wish to speak?
I'll move the recommendations as stated, except for D, which would be receives Tauranga Art Gallery's final statement of intent with the dates there, and requests further information, further financial information from the Tauranga Art Gallery.
Sorry, that's just pertaining to the art gallery. You're not prepared to move the others yet. We'll deal with this. We're happy to do the whole lot. Yep. So you're moving A to G, including the additional resolution, not resolution, the additional words that you wish to move. Seconder for that. Councillor Robson, you have a question? You have a question. It has been seconded by Councillor Clout. Question by Councillor Robson.
It relates to, and I don't know whether we're under some time pressure here, but we've had some discussion around art gallery, but I think there's more discussion to be had about how we move forward from this, and I'm interested in what the process is, so I'm concerned we're already in the process of sort of discussing a motion. My question relates to BVL. There was a submission made recently with regard to the plan. The response to that submission raised issues around the effective funding of BVL and what the real cost was. It raised questions about the nature of the transactions and transparency of transactions between the City Council and BVL. And I suppose I was looking for some clarification about whether BVL would be looking to make more transparent in its reporting to the community and of course to TCC, who are the effective owners, what the full nature of the support that BVL gets in a way that the community could understand. Now, the submission to the plan didn't get a detailed response, but I believe there is a response required. and I wanted to ask whether BVL were aware of that question that had come to us, whether they had a view on how they'd respond to it.
So that feedback was given to BVL. So on page 15 of the statement of intent, it outlines the community outcome subsidy, the depreciation, the debt servicing grant. So all of that is detailed in there. But you're wanting more than that?
Councillor Robson, does page 60 of the agenda, which is page 15
I
of
have
the...
it in front of me here.
Yeah, does that satisfy the issue in your view? Whilst I have never been an accountant and I've never been subject to disciplinary action by an accounting body for incompetence and or negligence, that is easily read and understood by a layperson such as myself and not somebody holding themselves out as a professional.
Yeah, I think the issue is the clarity for the community around the effective cost to the ratepayers of the city. I think it has a degree of legitimacy, that question. I think without how can I put, compromise, it is a conversation that I've raised as Chair of Finance, Audit and Risk with our finance team about how we make that clear, and I just wondered whether that conversation had been had with BVL, because I didn't want to blindside them, and I wanted to make sure that either they were on board or that their response would align with perhaps where we might wind up being in terms of, say, our annual report or a subsequent annual report. So I was really looking more for that. Financial documents or presentations such as this are not easy for our community to understand, and one of the challenges from our community regularly is we present things in a way that obfuscates rather than clarifies, and an example of that would be the way we buried the provisions relating to Bella Vista in the notes to our last annual report as TCC, and even the media required some assistance to identify where we'd put those numbers. We certainly weren't in a situation where we were trying to be transparent. So I suppose what I'm saying is these financials don't really make it clear to a lay member of the community what the total costs are. And it's the question was, I don't want to ambush BVL, but a BVL aware of the issue, party to the conversation, comfortable with having those conversations.
So just through the chair, we have had the conversations with BVL and they are comfortable with that. And so maybe it's about reminding them when they present their annual report that they talk to it in that way.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's been a motion moved by... Do you have a further question, Councillor Baldock? I am allowing questions. Moved and seconded, yep. So, Councillor Mason, you wish to speak to it?
Yeah, I think that it is the CCO model has been working well for Tauranga City Council and the community for the past number of years, and it's getting better and better. The financials are there. In one case, there is this lack of clarity, which we need to sort out, and with the art gallery, which we'll do so. But essentially, we are well served by our CCOs. Anne is doing an excellent job putting managing the relationships. Something I think that we tend to focus on the Bay venues and the Art Gallery Trust and Tourism Bay of Plenty, but I just would like to also recognise the excuse me, Bobplas is a particular success, and whilst we don't have a lot of particular focus on it, we in terms of the amount of time that we spend on it in the CCO working group, we do keep a watching eye over it because it's got much wider applicability throughout Bay of Plenty and Gisborne. but also I think, as you well know, the local government funding agency is part of is a CCO as well. So let's not forget those. Those are all part of the same department, managed by Anne. And so and also I think just want to recognise the relationship with the Western Bay, who are co-shareholders with Tourism Bay of Plenty. So it's going very well. As with all relationships of this nature, there can be challenges from time to time, and we manage those well with the relationships. I think the communication with the working group and the rest of the councillors has certainly improved in terms of the raising, discussing any the agendas and the minutes with the rest of the councillors, and that is going pretty well. Bay of News has produced a monthly document that comes out, all councillors be aware of, and I'm sure they read diligently, which gives a bit of more of a snapshot of what they're doing. So yeah, it's been a good couple of years. I think also that the council controlled recruitment of board members is going well, broadly speaking, and generally, yeah, we're well served. And I would urge councillors certainly in the next triennium to look at the CCO model for other parts of council activities. Thank you.
You, seconder, you wish to speak?
Yes, just very briefly. Certainly the CCO model seems to work very effectively in these examples we're talking about today. I just want to add some thanks to Councillor Mason, who has chaired the CCO working group over the last 3 years, and I think he's been quite instrumental. How many, 2 years? 2 years, thank you. So,
fortunately, we're passing of
sorry,
Councillor
yes, that's correct. So the last 2 years, and I think his chairmanship has been very astute and has encouraged good relationships with our CCO. So we will miss you, Councillor Mason, in that space. Thank you.
Further speakers? Councillor Rob?
Yeah, look, I'm not uncomfortable supporting the motion as intended. I appreciate the recognition of the art gallery issue. I do think there's more that needs to be done in terms of, how can I put it, making sure that the control is exercised effectively for the betterment of all the city. I do find that sometimes we enter into a supportive situation with regard to the aspirations of our CCOs and perhaps don't hold them to account as much as we should. My experience is they fall into the same pattern of behaviour as their owners, that they're inclined to spin a little too much, and sometimes their annual reports lack a bit of balance. By way of an example, I would observe that the High Performance Sports Centre, despite promises at the time of its inception, has had significant negative impacts on Blake Park, and the impact on community sport is having to be dealt with. That Tourism Bay of Plenty in and of itself, I think, requires assistance in clarifying really what its role is and where it steps over the line into competing with businesses established purely in the private sector. So I think there's a lot of things to work on here. However, that being the case, I see no better models for the current operations that sit within the CCO framework. I just see the need to do more work, and in that regard, I'd like to concur with Councillor Kelvin Clout. Max, you've done one hell of a job unrecognised in this space. It is not easy. You know that. You know how much work there is to do. You know, whoever sits in this chamber next triennium, I hope we get someone else as committed to this space and is prepared to be as open as you are around certain issues. It's really, really important. These are major areas of our relationship with our community, and in some senses the wider world, certainly Tourism Bay of Plenty. So yeah, for all the work you've done, thank you. For where we are, it's good, but there's still work to do. And more important than anything else, we've got to take how can I put it, the spin out of our relationships. We've got to get more honesty in our relations between us and our CCOs, and certainly more between our CCOs and our community. Good, but we can do better. Thank you.
Councillor Malloy.
Just to add my voice to thanks to Councillor Mason and to Anne Blakeway for guiding us through the last few years. We've been through some challenging times, difficult times. We're moving forward, and yeah, just a big thank you.
Further speakers, Councillor Baldock.
Yes, I likewise acknowledge what Councillor Mason has done, and also we appreciate what work Anne does for us too. It is there is a lot of extra work in working with our CCOs. I hope that we may just take a bit of a breath in regard to the art gallery. We've asked for some clarification. I hope we don't go leaping to conclusions. They are a trust as well as a CCO. They have a foundation behind them which has significant resources. So I hope we don't go back to the days of old when annual plan submissions and so on and allocations became a bit of a scrap. We have a very good working relationship. The art gallery is recognised as being, you know, up there in this nation's art galleries, and it's delivering great things for the city. And I think when we get the information back, we'll be able to work that through. Likewise, this you know, taking some issues with BVL and its operations, we see an organisation that delivers very, very well, and the High Performance Sports Centre, whilst having created additional pressures on Blake Park, has delivered enormous things for the city in terms of our recognition as a place of excellence for sport. And that pays huge dividends for us. We have pressures on many of our facilities. That's why we need to go into future, whoever is around this table, go into future LTP deliberations with a really sensible expectation of what we can continue to deliver with the funding that we have appropriated from our ratepayers. I think that's more the discussion. We can't keep squeezing BVL to deliver the same results with the same community subsidy. They're delivering more for less per ratepayer every year, and that is commendable. And so I hope we keep that in mind.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. First of all, the BOPLAS, it's disappointing that they're not happy about putting the years that they've completed different projects in and separated what they've done in the past to what they're working on at the moment. And sometimes we have to be careful what we wish for. I don't believe CCO models are always a good thing. I think they're less transparent, and they sometimes tend to go off on their own tangent and don't necessarily meet what's best for the community. Also, I'd like to make a point about automatic CPI increases. I think moving forward, I hope the next council will do these on a business case model and not just because we do it each year. So I hope the next council will spend some more time discussing that with the different CCOs.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. Just very briefly, at a couple of local government conferences last year and the year before, a couple of other councillors from other areas approached me and asked about and commented and commended us on our CCO working groups and our CCOs and how they operated. So we are leading the way in local government around effective CCOs. I also note that, Tourism Bay of Plenty's moved to destination management, but also that they are looking at alternative funding mechanisms, which I think is a great initiative, and hopefully the others are too.
No, I just want to again reiterate the words of my colleagues in terms of Councillor Gail McIntosh, Councillor Max Mason, Councillor Larry Baldock and Councillor Terry Malloy. Thank you for the additional work that you have done, the additional level of... Oh, sorry, Councillor Kraut. That's cause for a code of conduct, so I withdraw and apologise straight away. And Councillor Clout as well, thank you for the additional time and additional work and additional scrutiny ably served by Anne and the staff, the officers as well. The additional scrutiny that you apply to our relationship with the council-controlled organisations before it comes to the council table, it does provide me certainly with a level of comfort once it's been through your hands and it comes to the council table. So thank you for that. Any further speakers? Right reply, Councillor Mason.
Very briefly, thank you for the kind words, especially to Anne. However, the reason why there are CCOs and other models, this isn't the only model, but this is one model which is effectively a diffuse ownership and a delegation of governance, but not responsibility, to a group of people who can do it better than the council can do it. That's the incredibly important part of this. And it is a really good, I think, a mature and frame of mind when councillors can say, we think that or those people can do this better than we can do it from a governance perspective. So I really just want to again reiterate that there are other ways of doing things than we do, you only have to look at what's not going well in the city, potentially transport, potentially the city centre. There are a lot of different ways of managing and governing entities, and I think that it behoves the next council to really look closely at what's the best way, not to control for control's sake, but to actually see what is the best outcome for the community and what is the best structure to do that. And lastly, I just want to say, no, it isn't always the best model. However, would we be confident enough to do what BVL has done in one of their overall measures of success, number 4 in the page 49, where they have said, in terms of customers, 85% of customer survey participants are satisfied with the overall customer experience. That is a bold statement, and that shows confidence and competence. And I would challenge both senior management and the councillors to be bold enough to actually say that they will do the same in the coming years.
Thank you. Right reply excised. I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? That is carried. Turning now, colleagues, to page 203 of your agenda, approval of the draft naming policy. And I'm going to do standing orders right this time. Can I have a mover that we suspend standing orders? Oh, we've got to do the ESE. Yep, the Enduring Statement of Expectations. Thank you. 7. Thank you. We'll move to that. Councillor Mason, do you wish to introduce this paper?
Just only to say that we've probably said everything that needs to be said. In relation to the enduring expectations, these are, as we all know, the long-term statements of what the council wants over beyond 1 year, so three years ahead. A significant review has taken place, and as you, if you go through in Appendix A, every single change that has taken place has been fine-tuned. It's been going back and forth with the CCOs, with CCO management group, and so I think it's been very, very diligently done. It is heightened or deepened, if you want, the relationship between the CCOs, both management and governance, and the council by fine-tuning all of these aspects. So, if there's any questions, I guess put it on to Anne.
Thank you. Ms. Blakeway, do you wish to speak to any part of the ESC report? No. Any questions, colleagues? No. In that case, is there a mover for it? A move by Councillor Mason, seconded by Councillor Baldock. Any discussion? Mover? Seconder? Other speakers? I'll put Councillor Stewart.
Yeah, apologies, Mr. Chair. For some reason, I have not read this part of my agenda, which is remiss of me, but I haven't read it, so I'll abstain because I haven't read that for whatever reason. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I will now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against?
Abstain. Thanks.
Abstentions? Abstention, Councillor Stewart, and that is carried. Now we move to page 203, colleagues. Can I please have a mover that we suspend standing orders just while we go through issue by issue and then remember to reinstate standing orders? Moved by Councillor Clout, seconded by Councillor Brown. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay. Do we have somebody, Emma, would you like to introduce the paper that's come back to us following the lengthy issues and options discussion we had the other day?
Through you, Mr Chair, I'm just happy to take it as read and to go through the issues and options.
Any questions at this stage before I start going through the issues and options? Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Did read this one, as did the rest of it, the agenda. Page 207, regarding option 3.1, do not require council approval for street names. Does that refer to new street names, just for clarity?
Through the chair, it refers to street names generally, so new and existing.
Will Councillor Mason, is that on option 3? We can get to that. Yep.
Yep. I just wondered if I could ask, with the process, the first one, so process for deciding new street names. So you've got new street name is the first box on the left, and then goes developers provide a minimum of 3 proposed names, and then off to the carrying on going right. And then it says staff determine. So this is in the diamond. Staff determine if names meet criteria, recommend to council, and then through to the oval, names approved. My understanding was that the council doesn't approve the names. Is that not?
Through the chair, so this, yes, council doesn't approve the street names at the moment, but when we went back and reviewed the resolutions and the discussion from the previous June meeting, it wasn't clear whether that was the position that council wanted to take, was to have staff continuing to approve the street names, or whether that was to be a decision of council. We're recommending that it stays the status quo and be staff, so yeah.
Yeah, just Rowan, I found it really interesting that there's about 50 names a year, broadly speaking, street names a year that we're actually deciding on. And the last thing we want is councillors to be involved in, one street name per week to be, debating. So I think it's wonderful that the council staff would be.
Okay, look, let's look at option 1, colleagues, in terms of the naming of reserves. Does anybody have any questions, or do you propose anything different to the recommendations laid out therein? Okay, issue 2, colleagues, the consultation on the names of reserves. If you scroll over to page 206, you can see the whole table there. 2.1 is recommended, and there are other items not recommended. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Page 206, 2.2, does that apply to new names for reserves or existing? So similar to my other question, it's not clear.
Through the chair, so 2.2 is the dual naming. So if there was an opportunity to dual name, council would have the decision as to whether they would accept dual naming of a reserve, but the name that we receive would not be consulted on.
And is that for new reserves?
It's dual naming, so it would apply to new and existing.
Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, can I just clarify on that dual naming? I thought we had some discussion, I think back in June, about if it was a te reo name that, you know, the English name would follow, or if it was an English name about an object or a noun maybe, that was easily translated into te reo, that was a different matter than having two names that had completely different meanings. Can I just get clarification? An absolute translation of where we had a dual, and that.
So through the chair, the principle of dual naming is that you have an English and a te reo Māori name would be first, so it'll be te reo Māori name and then an English name. It wouldn't necessarily need to be a translation of the English name, it could be a name, so yeah.
Where in the options does this get addressed? Is it 2.2 or? I mean, if we go with 2.1, it's just left. We don't consult and we leave it to staff. I just feel we need to give some guidance there that it gets confusing if you have if it's not a translation, in my opinion. You end up with two street names or two reserve names. Is this just reserves or streets as well? Just
Reserves at this
reserves.
stage. You could, Councillor Baldock, in terms of before the resolutions come, look at policy 5.2 in terms of reserve naming, and perhaps consider a statement on literal translation. I'm not sure personally whether that's something the policy needs to be specific or prescriptive about. I forget, Matua, what's a te reo name for brown? For brown? Yeah. So if we had Paraone Iti Street for Brownless Street, you know, that'd be a more like kind of a literal translation, but yeah, it may be more appropriate to name it Ihaka Street, I think. So, but yeah, change the word street for reserve in my previous comment. Yeah, I mean, if you want, are you sure you want to be that prescriptive, councillor? Thank you. Further discussion, questions on issue 1, Councillor Mason. Issue 2, sorry, Councillor Mason.
So we're still on reserve, sorry, that's going back, yep. So could I ask two questions? One is how, well, let's go to a practical example, say Coolum Park. So apparently, I don't know if it's correct, but somewhere I read that Coolum it's a town in India or Cambodia or someplace. And so it's got apparently no actual connection to Tauranga. So if it was, somebody said, why don't we call it Waka Reserve or something like that? Say, because there were 1,000 wakas or whatever the te reo pronounced 1,000 wakas is. So would it be sort of Waka Coolum Reserve? Is that the potential process? How does that work?
So through the chair, if somebody came to you with that proposal, council will be asked to decide, do you want to have the dual name, Waka Coolum Park, or would you just want to have that dual name, or would you want to rename it Waka Park and get rid of the Coolum? That would be a decision for council to make, but we wouldn't necessarily consult on. We would say, when we go out to the public, we would say, we've got a dual name, Waka Coolum Park, do you like it? But we wouldn't actually offer the opportunity for people to say, well, I think it should be Canoe or something.
And what generally, so in the policy it says, or draft policy it says that about dual naming, it's it's generally what the policy intent is to do. What is the process? Say, would the council office, for example, get together and say, well, these are 50 parks we think can have a dual name or whatever. What would trigger it? That's what I'm not certain about. How do the changes start?
So through the chair, generally in the past where we have changed a name, we've had approaches from iwi and hapu to change a name, so that could be one option. As staff, we have had a look at whether there are options to take a city-wide approach and look at our naming. So those are the two ways that we would come with whether we would dual name it. But generally at the moment it's been approached on specific parks and reserves.
Councillor Robson.
I'd like to, and I appreciate we're back with standing orders. We're free flowing. The dual naming thing is I'm just trying to get clarity about what even that term specifically means, because I think Aoraki, Mount Cook, it's either, depending on how you want to refer to it, you can refer to it by one name or the other, but you don't use both. It has two names. Some people call it Aoraki Mount Cook, but that's kind of weird to me. It used to be Mount Cook and now it's Aoraki to me. So with the dual naming thing, I'm not 100% clear on, and it goes back to the point raised by Councillor Mason when he talked about would you call it Waka Coolan Park or Coolan Waka Reserve or whatever. I'm not clear on what we mean by dual naming, and I know that, for instance, in New South Wales, the Australians, having had an epiphany in the last while and forgetting that Australia was discovered 65,000 years ago, have suddenly realised that some of their geographic features may have names well before the Europeans decided to discover them. But the names are separate. They're dual names, but you use them independently. They're separate names for the same things that come from different cultures and different histories. So I'm just trying to get clarity about when we say dual naming, whether we're talking about literally two names in the one phrase label or separate names that are used independently of each other.
Good question. I mean, the policy is not that prescriptive in that regard, unless you look at 5.1.1 on page 211, the last sentence in there, which says when dual naming is reserved, the Te Reo Māori name will be positioned first. I'll raise it as an issue 4 later on, but in terms of, is it like in the lakes where you have a translation or not a translation, it's a Te Reo Māori name, but it's a wider Te Reo Māori name underneath. The policy is not prescriptive in that regard. Would you like it to be? I guess that's the question I'd have.
I think we need to, and it's a bit like earlier conversation around coastal structures, we need to get some clarity before we sign things off. Otherwise, we're not actually giving staff guidance, we're giving staff confusion. And the experience of this place is that when we give staff confusion, we're often unreasonable in our response to them attempting to make decisions. So I think for the benefit of staff, some degree of prescription or at least clarity, would be helpful.
What I propose moving forward is that if elected members are able to provide that clarity, because it is our call in terms of what comes first. Councillor Baldock's already raised an issue he's thinking about in terms of translation, literal or otherwise, and also around what does dual naming mean? Is it a Aoraki Mount Cook, Aotearoa New Zealand, or is it New Zealand / Aotearoa? What does that mean? And so perhaps that's a lunch break issue, I'm not sure. Emma.
Through the chair, we have added a definition of dual naming, and it refers to a reserve that has both a Te Reo Māori name and an English name. At the moment, the example that we have is Gate Pā Domain Pukahinahina. Under this policy, you would have Pukahinahina Gate Pā Domain. Whether you refer to it as Pukahinahina or Gate Pā Domain is a choice, but it would obviously be what is on the sign will have both names in recognition that it has two names. How we refer to it practically in everyday conversation could just be how we do it. So, for example, people still say Mount Egmont, whereas I would say Taranaki. But we do know it has official dual name, Taranaki Mount Egmont, and Aoraki Mount Cook is its official name, whether we refer to it as either one.
Does that, does that cover that off sufficiently in terms of, obviously people are going to, in general parlance, refer to things informally and formally, but does that really cover that issue off for you, Councillor Robson?
It's the practicality, it's when it gets down to the practical issue of staff on the ground deciding things. I'm thinking signage, commenting on things, is it acceptable to only use one of the names in documents? So if we just talk about Pukehinahina, is everyone comfortable, or do they want the other name in there as well? It's that sort of, are we clear about what we're trying to do? Do we always use both names in recognition that we're bicultural and Treaty Waitangi? I just want a little bit of clarity about where we're trying to get to with this. What's the purpose? Perhaps what's the purpose we're trying to achieve? What's the outcome we're seeking? Part of it's educational. My partner's Welsh speaking, as people may know, and in Wales they label things in Welsh and English partly to educate all the English speakers.
I do wonder whether in seeking to have, a prescriptive naming convention in terms of how we identify in documents and things, whether that's something that can be adopted by convention later on. Otherwise, then we open up the discussion about macrons or not, which, in terms of dialect, what are we using? One would hope that that we're using the local dialect as opposed to the standard one, So I think those issues can be operationalised through convention, but Ms Joyce, do you have further response to Councillor Robson on that?
Just if I could, through the chair, in my experience, where we have had a dual name, the convention would be, if we were referring to it in a formal report to council, we would refer to it by its correct name. So, for example, we would always say Mongafo Mount Eden. We wouldn't say Mongafo Mount Eden. It would be, that would be its name, and it would be in a formal report. But if we were talking colloquially to each other as staff, determining how we were going to kill rats on Mongafo, we would say Mongafo, or we would say Mount Eden. So it would just work.
Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and be any more prescriptive than I was. When I read 5.2.6, renaming of reserves may be supported where a new name would better meet the objectives of the policy to promote a local identity and mana whenua connections. Council recognises that in order to maintain local identity, a dual name may be appropriate. Perhaps if this had been in place, when we got back to Te Papa o na Manu Poratakataka, we may have allowed Phoenix Park to, Phoenix, not car park, but Phoenix could have been a dual name, we just would have got through that a lot easier, I think. So I'm happy there's enough, and I don't personally think we can get prescriptive enough. We've got to allow some intelligence to take place in other parts of the building rather than in this room. So I rest my case, and I'm happy to move it when questions are finished.
Thank you. I take that indication. Further comments, questions, Councillor Brown. Again, we're on issue.
Maybe overall, I just think we need to be a bit clearer when we're talking about names for new reserves. The word new needs to be used a lot more, I think, through this report's already written, but through perhaps the policy itself, because I know the public perception, when we first talked about this in June, everyone thought we were renaming every street, and we're talking about naming streets that exist. We need to be very, very clear when we're talking about the naming of a new street or new reserve versus the renaming of an existing, and I'd like to see the word new and existing used throughout for clarity, please. We get it, but the community probably don't.
In terms of that issue raised by Councillor Brown, there is no distinction in the policy. That would require a slightly different direction to the previous committee. Is that correct, Emma?
Through the chair, at the last committee meeting, if I just go back to the recommendations, what we agreed was that we wouldn't necessarily consult on new names, but we can, whether we add new and existing into the policy for clarification, I think that could be done without contradicting ourselves.
And to that end, I would propose we consider 2.3, and that is within the confines of a straw poll, and I would accept the majority will in that regard. But option 2.3 does make the distinction when there is a renaming, then that is something that, if option 2.3 were to prevail, that is something which would be consulted upon, as opposed to a new name, which would not. Now, the issue is that is possibly inconsistent with the agreed name, the agreed position around names gifted by mana whenua. So, I guess my question to Ms. Joyce is, if we adopted 2.3, and nothing has so far been put, but if we adopted 2.3, could you make it consistent with the approach that names gifted by mana whenua are adopted? And I would, how could you do that?
Through the chair, this is off the top of my head, I think the question would be, if we went out to consultation, we would ask people to say, do you agree that we should rename this park? But we would probably give them, this is the name that we're looking for. People could obviously comment on whether they liked it or not, but when we consider the renaming decision, it would be challenging not to consider those people who don't like or do like the name. So people would still give their opinion on the name, but we ourselves couldn't make a determination on that. We could only decide to rename or not the actual word name that we're given.
So it's a two-stage process. You consult on whether you rename, and then depending on that outcome, you then choose to rename or not, and in doing that you may accept the name gifted by mana whenua should they propose one, and so it's a two-stage sort of a process. Okay, thank you. So, Councillor Brown?
Probably more related to issue 3, which is the approval of street names, should be the approval of new street names. I think we just need to be very careful when we use the word existing and new.
We'll address that.
Yeah, but applies across the whole policy.
Yeah, we'll address that in option 3. So, Councillor Robson?
So again, on the renaming thing, if you're renaming, i.e. changing the name of something from Robson to Baldock, that's quite different to saying you're going to change the name from Robson to Robson stroke Baldock. It's a different process, has different implications, and one, you're losing something. Some people might say that's a good thing, getting rid of Robson, replacing it with Baldock. That's what we want, that's the statement we want. So there is a nuance in there, and again, so getting clarity around, is adding a name, whatever it might be, renaming, or does it sit, in other words, in 2.3?
So that would be an example of dual naming. So one of the decisions, so if we came in today with a renaming proposal, the council would be able to make a decision. Well, we still want to have Robson, but we also like the idea of having Baldock, so it would be a preference expressed for dual naming.
Love that example.
Seemed to make sense at the time.
Just to, I won't say how I'd vote on that, but just to make it clear, in 5.3.5, council will only change street names following so there's clear definition there about when we're going to, and I think that's adequate. There may be occasion when, due to history and everything else, we may, want to change, but we're ruling out private applications for street names, so I think that makes it pretty clear.
Question or observation was in relation to reserves. Obviously 2.3 relates to reserves, so it's not with regard to streets. It's 2.3, it's reserves. But I think it's not about prescription, it's about clarity and of definition. So it's not about prescribing what needs to happen, but it's understanding what we mean when we use a word or we use a phrase.
So the question is, then, if we adopted 2.3, does that mean that we are consulting on dual naming? And therefore that then gives rise to the question of, are we then consulting on a gifted name? So, would you be proposing that we consult on dual naming, councillor?
Yes, I would. And to be honest, I would also believe we should consult on gifted names. I think the idea that because something is a gift, it has to be accepted is, is something that requires some discussion, some nuancing. There are sometimes, then I've been offered gifts by some people. I mean, the gift of the fee to stand in central government. If I choose not to stand in local government, then I've declined that offer. Thank you very much, Councillor Baldock. So not all gifts are given, if you like, in a way that we have to accept. So.
Okay, so those two issues, I think, are things that we can deal with in a straw poll. Councillor Baldock?
Just to speak to it, I mean, if we haven't learnt from recent experience, consultation does not, when it comes to naming things, there's a function of leadership, and we delegate to chief executive and staff. You go out and consult on anything regarding a name, you're going to get a whole lot of, it's just human nature. We like things, we don't like things, we want that name, we don't. You don't get anything clear, and we are just making a mess of the whole thing. We have to name things. That's what this council does. New streets, new reserves. Someone's got to name it. Yes, you have a bit of discussion around, but look, the idea of consulting on this, I believe it was a mistake with Te Papa Ona Manu Poratakataka, particularly at the late stage, but I'm comfortable with the 2.1, quite frankly, but we'll do a straw poll.
Councillor Robson, we're coming to a short straw poll shortly.
I think Te Papa Ona Manu Poratakataka is an interesting example because we didn't do proper engagement. We dropped the name on people at late notice, and it was associated with a project which was completely out of cluster bubble. There were a lot of statements arrayed around it, promises made that weren't kept. Notwithstanding that, and the consultation, I voted to support the name Te Papa Ona Manu Poratakataka. So consultation isn't putting things to a referendum, and it should be part of a process which started with proper engagement. So I think people who cite that example are sort of focusing a whole lot of attention on one particular aspect of something that was a victim of poor process all the way along, the sort of transformational activities that we engaged in without thinking, making promises that we were incapable of keeping. There was a whole lot of issues that drove that process, but the point I make is in this chamber, even in the light of what we got back, understanding the fact that we'd compromised the thing to hell, I chose to exercise what I thought was the right decision for this community. So perhaps if everyone had the courage to do that, we wouldn't have some of these problems.
Okay, so to that end, colleagues, I'm going to put to you by way of straw poll the statement that we undertake consultation on reserve renaming, including dual naming. So there's two parts to that: reserve renaming, including dual naming, and that we undertake consultation. The renaming or the dual naming, for as it pertains to reserves only. That includes dual names, and yes, it does. Yes, it does. By necessity, it must, if the logic flows. Yeah. So that's dual names, including renaming. Who is of the opinion that that is a good idea? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That will form part of a draft resolution which you can vote for or vote against at the conclusion of this process. Okay. So now moving forward to issue 3, the approval of street names. For your guidance, if you go to 207, you've got the table there, 3.1, 3.2. Option 3.1, the recommended one, is do not require council approval for street names. Now this is of course when new street names, I think Councillor Brown was alluding to. And 3.2 require approval for street names. Now, the question I have in regard to that, the policy states, I'll come to you, Councillor Malloy, the policy states that council will not allow private applications for changes of street name. What's the definition of private? That's on private land here. What's the definition of private? So is private an application by me to change Te Okoroa Drive to Crosby Boulevard, or is the definition of private an application by Mana Whenua or the Harbour Protection Society to rename a street something else? What's the definition of private?
Through the chair, so we've taken out in the draft policy before you any reference to private applications to just change names. A private in this case would be anybody who's not council, and that would have to be considered separately to the policy because there's no reference to it, so it could be anybody.
Councillor Brown, you suggested that in essence 3.1 suggests new street names, and of course existing street names is not, the policy is silent on that, so it would have to come to council anyway. Colleagues, so I put to you that we include the word new street names in there and we remain silent on others. Councillor Stewart, you wish to...
Yeah, thank you. It was something I was alluding to at the beginning of the process, that we should think differently about new streets, which I believe don't need consultation compared to existing.
Look, colleagues, Councillor Malloy.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on that also, the new streets, because I believe at the moment new streets, the process for naming those is good. You have to, as a developer, you have to consult with Mana Whenua around the naming of the street, and then you come up with 3 names. So the new street names coming forward are a much better balance. So the word new needs to go in there, as already decided. Thank you.
Colleagues, could you indicate if you're accepting of the word new within 3.1? Okay, so that will form part of the resolutions that come back to us. And so I would note that the policy does not contain provision for renaming existing streets. However, like all a council business, anybody can apply to council on any topic at any time. But there is no policy prescription around that particular issue. Issue number 3, table number 3, options for consulting. Sorry, where am I at? Yeah, this is the options for consulting on. We've got the Section 82 process, special consultative procedure or a blend, which is which is option 3. That is the staff recommended option. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I support that. Just would like clarity though on what that looks like, informal feedback, and what does that look like, and special consultative procedure as well.
So through the chair, for the Section 82, if you go down that line, we're looking at doing an informal online survey, as well as talking to some particular groups. So obviously the Mana Whenua Partnership Group here at TCC and the Historical Society. In terms of the special consultative procedure, that will be the opportunity to make a formal submission, whereas the Section 82, we're just trying to get a wider group of people to submit. A lot of people don't like making a formal submission. Hopefully we can still get their perspective through that informal.
Councillor Brown, then Councillor Baldock.
Is it possible, or would it be practical to include special consultative procedure in the definitions? I know we understand that speak, but others may not understand it, because if a definition is referring to things in the policy, like we haven't got private roads in there, we haven't got a definition of renaming. So can we just maybe look at the definitions to make sure that anything that may be ambiguous or unclear is actually covered in the definitions in the policy itself?
Yes, perhaps on the latter points there, defining SCP, we were talking about the process to adopt the policy itself. You wouldn't actually need to define the process to adopt the policy in the policy. So that's the decision for you guys to make at the moment.
Councillor Baldock?
Just not clear why we have we normally, when we adopt a draft policy, we go out to consult. So why are we making a little bit more prescriptive here in this case?
Through the chair, just when we do go out to formal submissions, a lot of people do not choose to go down that path, but they would still like to give feedback. So this gives us more of a scope to make sure everybody's views is captured. So for example, somebody who responds to a Facebook post from council, that feedback then also comes through, but it might not be not considered a formal submission through the SCP, but it gives us that opportunity to take that person's feedback into consideration.
Something sent out with the rates and water bills perhaps could be that sort of informal connection, perhaps?
Okay, further comments, discussion on that? No. Okay, colleagues, I just need an indication from staff, given the guidance that has been given from around this esteemed table, in terms of the wording of the policy, how long would it take to craft or amend the resolutions written to reflect that, which I will take separately, by the way, if there's a desire to do that, because I'm conscious of not breaking for an hour for lunch if something can be done within sort of 5 minutes, and then we can break after that.
5 is fine.
5 is fine?
It really is just reworking B,
Okay.
adding a word to C,
Okay.
and then probably having another resolution at the bottom which delegates the final sign-off to somebody, whether that's the chair, whether that's the mayor, whether it's a combination, the chief executive, because what you'll be adopting isn't actually what's printed here at the moment.
Yep.
It needs to be a bit of a rewrite.
Okay.
But yeah, 5 minutes just to probably rewrite B is the main one.
5 minutes is sufficient, not an hour. That's good. Thank you for that. Look, can I have a move that we reinstate standing orders? Moved by Councillor Baldock, seconded by Councillor Mason. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. We will adjourn for 5 or 6 minutes, and we will get those resolutions on screen prior to the lunch break. we have those up on the screen? We have some resolutions on screen which reflect the discussion which we have had this afternoon. And colleagues, when those go up there, could you please indicate whether you want the resolutions to be taken separately or together? In the absence of any indication, I will take them all together, but that is up to colleagues. Councillor Baldock, your name is in the draft of the moving. Are you still prepared to move that? No? Is somebody prepared to move what's on screen? Moved by Councillor Robson. Is there a seconder? Seconded for discussion by Councillor Stewart. Did you wish to speak to it, Councillor Robson?
I think we've discussed all the clauses. I think it is a draft for basically two levels of consultation. I think we could spend a lot of time here, you know, in the land of pedantry, sort of nuancing and adding likely and changing the words possible to probable and whatever else. But effectively, we need a starting point for the conversation. I think there's only one, and I don't believe it's that significant a change made to, you know, what was effectively proposed. So I think this is a good place to start. But it's certainly not where we necessarily will end up.
Thank you. Similar to Councillor Robson, it is a draft going out for consultation, so happy to support that.
Councillor Brown.
Sorry, Mr Chair, we didn't actually go through the statement of proposal when we were going through the agenda item, and I just have an issue with the second bullet point down. Encourage more Te Reo Māori names that are significant to mana whenua by allowing for renaming and dual naming of streets, reserves and other public areas. So we just maybe need that to reflect what we've done up there with the new and the versus existing. So I would be happy to support that, but if staff can take on board just the wording of the second bullet point to reflect that difference between existing and new. Because if you read it at the moment, it allows for renaming of streets, reserves and public places, just the way that it's worded.
Yeah, the statement of proposal before it goes out will be amended to reflect whatever council chooses to pass. Other speakers? Councillor Malloy.
Yes, I'll support it. I think consultation around this issue is incredibly important. I believe that you know, a name becomes very important to people. Your name, you identify with it over a period of time. I identify with Tauranga. A woman these days are more and more frequently keeping their maiden names because they identify with that. I'm just trying to say your names can become incredibly important. They become part of you, and I think so. I believe that consultation is absolutely important. I support the recommendations from mana whenua or the gifting. I strongly support that, but I think the consultation part is, at this stage anyway, is incredibly important. Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Yeah, as well as I'm happy to support it to go through the consultation. I think this will be a particularly important consultation because there is fear out there about Māori names. You know, elephant in the room. There are people that are very scared of that. We have a big part of our, you know, a number of people in our community who are that they do worry about it, and they have a lot of misconceptions, and there are other consultations going on where this is reflected in some ways. I think that the communication of this is incredibly important. I struggle to read this report. I'd read it several times before I got my head around it. I'm not sure I still have got all my head totally around it. but I did struggle, and so I think that if this is given to a comms person to write up into a report, I think things potentially could be lost or misconstrued. I think a lot if we in our the engagement documents can use practical examples. I gave one earlier on with the Waka Coolum Park sort of example, some things like that, or where they have happened in the past, or could have been done differently, or whatever it might be. That will really help people to get to where a level of understanding which will be much more practical and useful than perhaps some sort of high level concepts that are sort of in here. So I really would urge all councillors and staff to really put a lot of effort into this, into the consultation, the engagement, and how, particularly to look at how people are going to read it and not jump to conclusions. That's really important. If we do have a prejudice, it's very easy to read half of a sentence and then jump to a conclusion. Let's not allow that to happen in this situation.
Yeah, I have expressed my reservations about the amendments in B, but it is a draft going out to the public, and we'll see what the response is. I think the point Councillor Mason just made about jumping to conclusions, we're going to be hearing a lot of that on Thursday this week. And my concern here is that when you it depends how consultation is interpreted by those who sit around this seat, this chamber. If they always go by the majority, then very little is going to change. It does require some courage to see some names renamed because of, the way it was and the way it should be, and what respects minorities and particularly tangata whenua and so on. So that's my concern, and I hope we don't end up just with somewhere near an election process, everybody goes for what they think the majority are going to be happy with, rather than perhaps what is appropriate, right, for all the things that have happened in this city.
Mayor Brownless.
I'm quite happy that we haven't got into the renaming streets. I think that caused a lot of angst last time this topic was discussed. We do consult on everything these days. It's just a fact of life, and including, rightly, this very policy that we're discussing at the moment. It's going out for consultation. Therefore, I do support B, which says that it is right to consult on the name of new reserves. I think it just seems to make sense. You can't have it one way without the other sometimes. You've just got to do what is democratic. And perhaps less, sometimes that doesn't mean that things are a bit bureaucratic at the same time.
Okay, so from my perspective, the policy as will be written and will go out for consultation will state that new streets, the existing status quo position of developers producing suggested names and those being delegated to the Chief Executive, that will continue. That any proposals for renaming or dual naming of reserves will be consulted on with the public. And the third portion of this is that existing street names there will be no applications accepted for renaming of existing streets as per the policy. So though that's the policy in summation, are there any further speakers to it? Right of reply, Councillor Robson.
I think enough's been said.
We'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? That is carried. Thank you. So that concludes. Sorry. There was no objection. No, that was carried unanimously. Then we now move to discussion of late items. There are none. Can I please have a mover for the exclusion of the public? We just have a couple of small items there. moved by councillor Baldock, seconded by councillor Brown. I'll put that, all those in favour please say aye. Against and carried.